We're here with James DiEugenio. He's the publisher of kennedysandking.com and the author of JFK, The Evidence Today. We've got a piece of audio from a 1975 conference of the Assassination Information Bureau. It features a big panel of assassination researchers. There's Dick Gregory speaks, Donald Freed, Penn Jones Jr., Richard Popkin, Sherman Skolnick, Mae Brussell, Peter Dale Scott, and Mark Lane. So it's really a lot of different voices. And James, who is certainly at the forefront of assassination research today, is going to give it all a bit of some context and introduction. So Jim, thanks for talking. And yeah, what did you think of the audio?
Okay. Well, I have to tell you, I don't know if you're aware of this, but this particular conference is actually kind of legendary in the history of the JFK case. I had only read about it previously. I didn't know that there was an audio of this conference. Okay, this one of the main reasons that this thing has become part of the lore in JFK research is, first of all, I'm pretty sure it was the first public showing of the Zapruder film in front of a large crowd. And you can tell by listening to it, it was a pretty big crowd. I'd say it was probably at least 500 people, if not more. And Robert Groden, who had been working on this thing since he got it from the guy who used to work for Life magazine, Moses Weitzman, who allowed him to make a copy from the original. I'm pretty sure that this was the first in front of a large crowd showing of the film, and you can tell the impact it had because of the questions and the discussions that took place afterwards. Okay, now the Assassination Information Bureau originated with Carl Oglesby, who is the host of this thing, and a gentleman named Harvey Eugenian, who both lived in that Boston area at the time. All right. The AIB,
Sorry, what was the other guy's name again? Oglesby and
Harvey Eugenian. Okay. All right. And Harvey, let me make sure I got the pronunciation correct. Harvey Yazijian, Yazijian. Okay. All right. Now, him and Oglesby started the AIB. All right. And then what happened? One of the things that they were, and you can tell by listening to this long discussion, is that they were trying to lobby for a reopening of the Kennedy case. All right. Now, you could not pick a better time, because I think the time frame in this is the last day of January and the first couple of days of February 1975. Now, why is that such a key time frame? Because number one, you had the ending of the Watergate case with Nixon's resignations several months before. You had the opening of the Rockefeller Commission, okay? And you had the beginnings of the formation of the Church Committee. And all these things are related, all right, because first of all, with the exposure of Watergate, you had for the first time both James McCord and E. Howard Hunt were shown to the public. These were two former CIA agents, all right? And they were long-term guys, right? And what happened is that to some people, the finale of the Watergate case was kind of unsatisfactory because there began to be questions about the CIA's real role in Watergate. a couple of the speakers here talk about the Watergate solution as being something good. In retrospect, after the work of people like Jim Hogan in Secret Agenda, all right, I don't think it was so good, okay? Because I think the CIA had a larger role in Watergate than the people at this time knew. Although, granted, because of the Washington Post and the MSM coverage, and the fact that the Watergate Committee decided to adapt a lot of the Washington Post version of Watergate, all right, the only people at this time who were interested in the CIA's role in Watergate was a minority committee, okay, and a guy named Fred Thompson, who at that time was a lawyer friend of Howard Baker. He later published a book called At That Point in Time, which almost nobody read, okay, because everybody was so, and then Robert Redford made it all worse by doing that movie that was keyed around all the president's men, okay? But it did put Hunt and McCord out there. And I notice a lot of people talk about Hunt in this panel discussion. Now, the other thing is Dick Gregory. There's a movie out about Dick Gregory right now called, it's a documentary. All right. Dick Gregory is one of the most fascinating, one of the most interesting people um, who ever entered this arena, because Dick Gregory was a kind of, I guess the closest thing you can come is Mort Saul. Okay. Mort Saul was literally on top of the world before he got into the Kennedy case. Mort Saul was on the cover of Time magazine. He was one of the co-hosts of the Academy Awards. He had two shows going in LA at the time, one on TV and one on radio. And he threw it all away because he got interested in the JFK case. All right. And he became a pariah. Now, Dick Gregory is not quite the same. All right. But it's kind of similar. He had a brilliant young career that started in the 60s. The guy was on the Ed Sullivan show. Okay. It was on TV. Very funny guy. All right. And then he got involved in the civil rights cases. And then he got involved in the assassinations. All right. And by the way, he was involved in more than one. It wasn't just the JFK case. Okay. He was also involved in the Martin Luther King case, in which he co-wrote a book with Mark Lane called Murder in Memphis. All right. And he was also involved in the Malcolm X case. Right. Now, Dick Gregory is going to be, because out of this conference, this particular conference, where you had Grodin showing the Zapruder film for the first time to a large crowd, and Gregory being the first guest, the word about this got out, okay? And those two guys are going to be on Geraldo Rivera, okay, in, I think, about 6 months, all right? And for the very first time, the Zapruder film was going to be shown to a national audience. We know what the impact of that was, of course. All right. Because what that did is that on top of the Rockefeller Commission, on top of the Church Committee, you now had the beginning of the formation of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. So that's why a lot of people call this the season of inquiry, because that's really what it was. For the first time, you had explorations of what the CIA and the FBI were doing. Now, to show you just what was going on at this time period and why it was such a great time to have a conference on the JFK case, is that Gerald Ford understood that there was going to be a congressional committee formed because of all the revelations about that came out of the Watergate case, but also because William Colby, the director of the CIA, had fired James Angleton. And those stories had got into the press, all right, that Angleton was operating domestic operations. That's how Colby got rid of James Angleton, all right? And so Ford decided that he wanted to head off a congressional committee, all right, by forming his own commission. So he chose his vice president, Nelson Rockefeller, to go ahead and form a committee. And there was this private luncheon. I think it was mainly the New York Times. There might have been a couple of other media representatives there, but I think in large part it was the New York Times. And one of the editors for the New York Times asked Jerry Ford, he said, why did you appoint all these conservative people on this commission? Because it was people like Ronald Reagan and Lyman Lemnitzer, the Joint Chiefs of Staff guy from the Kennedy administration. All right. Those are the kind of people he appointed. And Ford said, because there's things that have to be concealed. And the guy goes, like what? And Gerald Ford blurted out, like assassinations. Okay. so Daniel Shore heard about this. Okay. I think he was working for CBS, and it got out there. So Colby instantly understood, well, we got a serious problem now. All right. And so what he said was that, he was talking about foreign assassinations. But the thing is, if you go ahead and read the dialogue, okay, in Daniel Shore's book, Clearing the Air, no, that was not the context of it. Ford just blurted out assassinations. And of course, because everybody knew he was on the Warren Commission, oh, that's what you mean. All right. Okay. And so what happens is now that you have two investigating committees, the Rockefeller Commission and the Church Committee, going on, and they overlap a little, the Church Committee. But then, if you can believe it, then there's a third committee, because in the House of Representatives, you have now Otis Pike, the representative from New York. He opens up his own inquiry. So in reality, what you had was three of them going on. And then, of course, it'll be joined later by the House Select Committee on Assassinations. So this was really, you could not have picked a better time to have one of these conferences, okay? And so this was the backdrop to what the heck was going on. It was really a period of turmoil, and people were thinking, oh my God, are we really going to unearth what the hell happened to this country in the 1960s? And there were obviously people who didn't want to do that, Ford being one of them. Okay. All right. So, because that's why he appointed Nelson Rockefeller to run the Rockefeller Committee, the commission rather. And you know who he appointed to be the chief counsel, don't you? David Bellin. David Bellin became the chief counsel to the Rockefeller Commission. Appointing David Bellin to run the Rockefeller Commission would be like, like putting a bank robber in front of a safe, at a huge bank in New York City. I mean, this is really one of the, I mean, if you ever needed a telltale about what Ford was up to with this thing, that was it when David Bellin came in to be and by the way, Cyril Wecht, who was called in, he was absolutely enraged about the stuff that was going on with the Rockefeller Commission, and also the fact that Bellin was running it, and he thought that, and with a lot of justifiability, that what happened is that Bellin had loaded it up, okay, in order not to have any real revelations about the Kennedy case, which they devoted a little bit of time to. All right. Now, the church committee was a little bit different because you had Frank Church was a very good senator and he was a friend of the Kennedy family. And so he let Gary Hart and Richard Schweiker run a subcommittee of the church committee. And that ended up producing a very interesting report. The Schweiker Hart report was probably one of the, well, I don't think there's very much question about this. As far as the federal government goes, it was the first time that you really had a strong criticism of what the methodology of the Warren Commission. Schweiker was very vocal about this. Okay. He was outraged when they found out about the CIA mafia plots to kill Castro. This was the first time that you really had that exposed in public. All right. And Schweiker was really, really angry about this. And so what happened is he hired Gayton Fonzie to be the chief investigator for the Schweiker Hart Committee. And Dave Marston was the chief attorney. He was also from Philadelphia. Okay. And we know what ended up happening there because Marston and and uh, and Gayton did such good work on that what happened is that when the House Select Committee was formed, Dick Sprague, who was the chief counsel, picked Bob Tannenbaum to go ahead and be the deputy counsel over the Kennedy case. And so Tannenbaum and his chief detective, Cliff Fenton, went over to visit Schweiker. They had a discussion, all right, about what the church committee had done. And then Schweiker asked, I'd like to talk to you in private. And so Fenton left. All right. And Schweiker picked up a folder of what Fonzie had done. And he gave it to Tannenbaum. And he told him the CIA was involved in the assassination of President Kennedy. And Tannenbaum, he said, this struck me like a thunderbolt. Okay, I mean, this wasn't some guy off the street. This wasn't some guy who'd written some book. This was a senator of the United States who had just run this committee. All right. And so he said they went home, they went to his apartment that night. And he said, we stayed up all night reading these reports. Okay. And Cliff didn't leave until dawn the next day. All right. And as Cliff left, he said, Bob, you know we're in over our heads, don't you? Okay. There's no way in the world they're going to let us do this. And Tannenbaum said, well, in retrospect, those were kind of wise words. Okay. So what I'm trying to say is this is the atmosphere. This is the mood. This is the tension that you had going on in the United States at this particular time period, you know? All right. And so in addition to Gregory, I mean, you had a kind of all-star lineup here. You had Donald Freed, a very famous writer and a playwright. Okay. You had Penn Jones. I think everybody knows who he is, the guy from Texas, the Midlothian Mirror. You had Richard Popkin, who wrote a very interesting book called The Second Oswald. You had Sherman Skolnick, our investigative reporter based in Chicago, who did some really good work on the Dorothy Hunt plane crash. You had Mae Brussell from California, who did some very interesting radio shows out there in, I think it was Carmel, California. Okay, the daughter of the I Magnin fortune, who decided to be the black sheep of the family and investigate the hidden history of the United States. All right. Then you had Peter Scott, okay, who's been doing this stuff for approximately 40 or 50 years, the professor from Berkeley. And then the closing act, of course, as it should have been, was Mark Lane, okay, who by this time had written at least 2 books on the JFK case and who had tried to represent uh, Lee Harvey Oswald before the Warren Commission. But J. Lee Rankin had turned him down. Okay. All, these people were supposed to be limited to, I think, like 5 minutes. Most of them went way over. Okay. And I can't really blame them because there was way too much to talk about. One of the recurring things is Howard Hunt. Okay, they talk about Hunt a lot because some of these people, like Mae Brussell and Scott, uh, and people like I think Popkin also, were trying to go ahead and connect Dallas, what happened in Dallas, okay, in '63, to the recently completed Watergate committee. And I have to say, I give these people a lot of credit for doing that, okay, because as I've come to believe, okay, there's a lot of overlapping people in those two. To call them scandals is to understate them. Okay, they were kind of like seismic earthquakes to the system. All right. And so, you had, and I don't, and the thing is, I don't think a lot of people understood this in those days. James McCord was actually part with David Phillips of the CIA campaign to discredit the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Okay. Something, by the way, which he denied. Because when he ended up in his last few years, he ended up in Pennsylvania. All right. I know his minister at the time. He wrote me a letter. Okay. And he said, Jim, when I talked to McCord, he said he really wasn't part of that. That was really the FBI's job. I said, well, either he's lying or the documents are lying. Okay. Because the documents say right there that it was him. Okay. And the other thing about McCord that I've always found so interesting is that he absolutely despised Fletcher Prouty. Okay, all you had to do was say his name, and McCord would go spastic. Okay, that's what a dyed in the wool Cold Warrior that James McCord was. And then, of course, we get this report, which I included in my obituary, about McCord, that according to one writer who talked to one of the people involved in the Watergate caper, Alfred Baldwin, McCord told him that he was in Dallas that day. Okay. So in other words, you have evidence that both McCord and Hunt were in Dallas that day. The evidence for Hunt being there is the Mark Lane book, Plausible Denial. All right, where, if you can believe it, Howard Hunt could not explain where the heck he was, on the day of the assassination. And James Angleton had written this memo to Richard Helms. We have to construct an alibi for Hunt being in Dallas that day. So it's not like there isn't an excuse to go ahead and connect these two shocks to the system together. There certainly is. And I give these people a lot of credit for going ahead and trying to do this. All right. There's also a recurring theme in this thing was there was no fairness. There was no even attempt to balance the scales of justice with the Warren Commission. Okay. Penn Jones talks about that. Like, where was the ABA? Okay. Where was the American Bar Association? And if you can believe it, if you read Sylvia Marr's book, and I think to a lesser extent Mark Lane, there was an ABA guy there for a few days, but according to them, he didn't say anything about how the process was proceeding, and he was only there for a very limited amount of time. It was almost like, you know, let's do some CYA. Let's get a guy from the ABA to come in and give us a rubber stamp. Okay. And then that will be our CYA for the fairness of our proceedings, when in fact there was no fairness at all, okay, to the proceedings. And in fact, Penn Jones is correct when he said the Midlothian Mirror printed more articles about the JFK assassination than any other newspaper in the country. He's absolutely correct about that, which is, a real and complete utter disgrace. All right. And by the way, they also knew, like Popkin talks about this, that Hunt was part of something called the DOD, the Domestic Operations Division of the CIA, which was relatively new. Okay, it was not an old division. It was relatively new. And so he was operating as part of that for a number of years, and it overlaps the Kennedy assassination. All right. So that was a very interesting piece of information that they brought out. Popkin also talks about the discussion in the White House between Nixon and Colson about the assassination of George Wallace, the attempted assassination, okay, by Bremer. And they talk about, maybe we should talk to Hunt about this, And I think I think I'm correct about this, but they actually did send Hunt down there, okay, to the scene of the crime, you know. Popkin also brings up this point about how the Kennedy assassination was really the culmination of the post-World War II national security state, the triumph of the national security state over democracy. And he traces it back to the Alger Hiss case, which I agree with that. Okay. That was the first manifestation that the national security state was not just for foreign affairs. The national security state was also going to be for domestic affairs. Okay. And we were going to make communism just as much a domestic issue as we were going to make it a fulcrum of our foreign policy. All right. Skolnick, I hate to say this, but I've never read at length his work on the Dorothy Hunt plane crash. Okay. I'm sorry to have to admit that. I can only read so much. All right. And I really am not up to speed on that, although I was aware of the whole Michelle Clark issue. Michelle Clark was a reporter for the CBS network who was very, very interested in that plane crash. Okay. And it really hurt her career. She ended up dying. Okay. But I'm not up to date on the actual circumstances. Sherman makes it sound like it was a kind of weird kind of death for her. So I really wish I knew more about that. Okay, unfortunately, I don't. Mae Brussell, of course, was always big on the White Russian community in the Dallas Fort Worth area, and she names a lot of these people who, to me, got a free pass. Well, everybody got a free pass at the Warren Commission, but but these people did get a free pass. They were actually called to testify, and they were allowed to do anything they wanted to Lee Harvey Oswald, and they did, and they made a very negative picture of him. Okay. And so they never really got to, the very obvious question is, why were you so friendly with a guy who's supposed to be a communist when in fact the White Russian community is supposed to be a right-wing organization funded by the CIA? So why were you, and the other question is, okay, why were you trying to separate Oswald from Marina? Because that's what they were seemed to be trying to do, And then, of course, when they invited Michael and Ruth Payne over, okay, that's when that whole process went into a high gear. She also brings up Albert Osborne, the guy on that bus supposedly with Oswald, who was very likely a CIA agent. Okay, she's wrong about Frank Capel. Okay, Frank Capel and Bobby Kennedy. All right, but I can't blame somebody who does that much work. Every once in a while, you're going to make a mistake. All right. And the book that I think she's referring to, that Alan Dulles wanted everybody to read, was The Assassins by a guy named Donovan. Okay. That he wanted, and that's a dead giveaway right there. I think that's at the first or second meeting of the Warren Commission. And he wants them to read this book that says all the assassinations in the United States were the work of one person. And then somebody, I think it was McCloy, said, well, wait a minute, what about the Lincoln case? And Dulles says, but that was mainly one guy, John Wilkes Booth. Now, if you ever needed to know what Alan Dulles was up to, there were 16 people arrested in the Lincoln case. Lincoln was not the only target. They almost killed Secretary of State Seward. Okay, he was stabbed several times. Okay, and the guy who stabbed Seward several times before he went to his death, he said, they didn't get but the half of us. So in other words, there were 30 people involved in the Lincoln conspiracy. And here's Dulles saying, well, that was mainly John Wilkes Booth. Okay. All right. Peter Scott said he made some very good points about JFK and Vietnam, because that he had been working on that for a number of years when the Pentagon Papers were first released. He did an interesting essay. I think it's in the Gravel edition of the Pentagon Papers. Okay, if you're interested in the Pentagon Papers, don't read the New York Times one. Okay, don't read that one. Get the Gravel version. Okay, that you can get in book form, which is much more inclusive and includes a section in there which is not in the New York Times version, called Phase Withdrawal, 1962 to 1964. And then Peter's essay, I think, is in that edition where he makes the case. I think it's one of the very first times anybody who had done it, okay, that that Kennedy was withdrawing from Vietnam. And we know that, of course, is a fact today. Okay, there's simply no question about that. Kennedy was getting out of Vietnam, all right? And the only way that we were going into Vietnam was over Kennedy's dead body, all right? Peter did some good work on the Marina Oswald thing, also with them trying to get her to say, this is almost funny. Yeah, he tried to kill Nixon too, didn't he? And you had to lock him in the bathroom, okay, or he was going to kill Nixon, right? And he has a very funny segment on that, which of course was pure BS. Okay, and then of course you had Mark Lane last, and he makes a, Mark was always very acute about how bad the media was on the JFK case. All right. And he talks about in his speech about how he believes, and he's correct about this, how the media, there's no other way to say this, the media covered up for the Warren Commission. That's not getting out of line at all, because we now know today that there were at least 3 attempts by reporters to honestly confront what the Warren Commission had done. All right. And one of them was at CBS, one of them was in the New York Times. Okay. And one of them was Time Life. Okay. Or actually Life magazine would be more exact. All right. And the question then becomes, what happened to them? And the answer is that they were all aborted. Okay. So he's exactly correct on this. And if you want to see exactly how it happened, take a look at the essay I did at kennedysandking.com about how CBS aided the JFK. I think it's why CBS aided the JFK cover up. All right. And he's perfectly correct about that. All right. And then I thought he had an interesting story about Henry Gonzalez, where the representative from Texas, where he said he advised Kennedy not to go because he thought it might be too dangerous.
Yeah, that was interesting.
Remember that? And Kennedy said, "No, don't worry, Henry. I talked to the Secret Service. They say I'll be okay."
Right.
These are the guys who were drinking grain alcohol at 3:30 in the morning at this after hours bar, this cellar. Okay. And then in the meantime, they had hired firemen to guard Nick Kennedy at his hotel. But don't worry, they told me everything is going to be okay. All right. Okay. So that had a kind of more than humor to it. Okay. And he talks, and Mark was always good about this. He talked about we needed to organize, and he set up the Citizens Commission of Inquiry at around this time, and them plus the AIB, they did a lot of groundwork to get people interested in the JFK case, and they ended up succeeding, of course, with the help of Groden and Gregory. That's why I say this is such an important conference. Okay, you know, and that helped create this storm of controversy that caused the opening of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. There were several questions afterwards. The one I thought that I'll devote some time to, and then that will be it for my intro. But Mark Lane talks about a discussion that he had in Garrison's office with either a representative or a supporter of Bobby Kennedy. And he said that this guy told Garrison that Bobby was supporting everything that he was doing. And when he became president, he would go ahead and reopen the case. All right. But he understood that he didn't want to say anything now because he understood that there were guns between him and the White House. Okay. So he's not going to speak out about it until after he wins the last primary. And so, well, we all know what happened to him. Okay. But Mark adds something to this. And he says that he had known both the Kennedys because he was working for them in New York. All right. And during the 1960 election. And after JFK was assassinated, he got through to Bobby Kennedy. And Bobby says, "Mark, what did you want to talk about?" And Mark says, "Well, I think you know what I want to talk about. And Bobby says words of the effect, yes, I think I do also. And I don't want to talk about that. So he just essentially said, no, we're not going to talk about that. This was in the days, in the several months after, where Bobby just kind of went into a shell, okay, about what had happened. All right, he didn't want to have anything to do with the Warren Commission. He didn't want to talk about. And so from 1964 then to 1968, okay, there was obviously, he'd been done a lot of thinking about it. And by that time, he was ready to go ahead and do his own inquiry. And of course, we know what happened. So this is a very important conference. And it's not just history. Okay, there's a lot of relevance to what these people were doing to this day and age. So this is really a good thing you've done. And I hope a lot of people listen to it because it's a very informative and relevant part of the history of the Kennedy. And by the way, not just that, but the history of the United States.
The Politics of Assassinations and Conspiracy. That was the title of a 3-day conference held in Boston on the weekend of January 31st through February 2nd, 1975. The conference, sponsored by the Cambridge-based Assassination Information Bureau, brought together leading researchers on conspiracies and the political assassination since 1963. This time we'll hear the Saturday night general session entitled Who Done It? There are some technical problems on the first part of this program, but those disappear later. We begin with Carl Oglesby of the Assassination Information Bureau.
Then, in contrast to this question, which we think should be the center question of political activity, because it's the key one, and it's the one that most people can relate to in the most immediate and real way. The issue that we simply don't know the truth about Dallas. There's been a cover-up, it's extensive, and we have to undo that. We have to get to the bottom of that. But now, inescapably and inevitably, on the basis of the knowledge that we don't know the truth, over the years, people involving themselves in these research and investigation activities have tried to do what they could to reconstruct it. The reconstructions are necessarily, in large part, speculative in most cases because we, by definition, don't have an available record that we can be confident about. In fact, it's a characteristic of this kind of research that one has to challenge in special ways the facts that present themselves for incorporation in the scheme. Anyway, our idea tonight is just to be sort of free form about it. Here are people, and we have a new addition, Dick Gregory, which whom I would like to welcome now. It warms us all that he's here, and it makes it a lot more real, and I think adds to the meaning and the ceremonial power of the moment. Dick hasn't talked publicly yet to the conference, so I thought we would start by listening to him. Then the others will follow in some or another order, which will presumably work itself out. Each one giving 5 or 8 minute or 10-minute maybe, 10-minute raps about the general questions raised in this area. Who do they think did it? What do they think were the issues? And our hope is that what we can get is an interplay of differing conceptions. And then maybe each person will be able to use these different conceptions and to form some synthesis, some view of what can be said, how much can be maintained at this point. So, without taking any more time, Dick Gregory to start it off.
We'd like to say thank you very much, and I've been out here for a long time, and it started, CIA surveillance and government surveillance with the civil rights movement, and I have a lot of people now, when you finish talking, they say, well, having all this information, aren't you worried about them killing you? I said, I thought about that once. And you see, you must understand one thing when you have this type of information and you're dealing with a group of degenerate freaks, that the only protection you have is tell it all. Then they can't kill you. See, they don't want to kill me. They would like to discredit me. They like to catch me in the backseat of a car with a naked 6-year-old boy. But you see, I'm ahead of the game because all the little dirty things I used to do, I don't do no more. I have the CIA tapping my phone. I have the FBI. I have the local police, the sheriff's police. And matter of fact, I don't know why they be tapping my phone because I really don't know that much. Matter of fact, I'm so out of it, I pick up the phone sometime and ask them, what's happening? And they told me there's a big conference going on in Boston. Matter of fact, I got cats be out in my bushes with tape recorders. I had a friend of mine came by my house and said, man, you got bushes look just like feet. I said, I got some bushes I'm gonna cut one day too. But you see, I contend that until they start tapping your phone, you really ain't into nothing. You know, I mean, anytime you can get a straight call and don't hear nothing on your line, you can just throw your little old junk away. Now, anytime somebody tapping your phone, you can have more fun with them than they can have with you. Like I just walked out of here just now, and Mark came over to the restaurant over there, and I was on the phone calling my wife, reading the alphabets off to her backwards. Now that don't sound like much to you, but being at this conference, when they pick that up on the tap tonight, they say they plotting something big tonight. All right. So my lawyer keeps saying, well, look, let's go to federal court and get an injunction to get the tap off your phone. And I said it was the federal court that told them they could put it on there. Right. So now, there's a lot of people that complain about it. Now, one day I was on a nationwide talk show, and I was, just complaining that, all the government agencies tap my phone. Well, this cat was so square. He says, I defy you to get on nationwide television and accuse the United States government of tapping your phone. What evidence do you have? I said, it's my phone. He said, well, that's not enough evidence to get on nationwide television and say the United States government is tapping your phone. Now, do you have hard, concrete evidence, and when did you find out your phone was tapped? I said, one night I got ready to call my brother and picked up the phone. He was already on the line. And he ain't got no telephone. Well, now he still wasn't happy. He said, if you're going to accuse the government on nationwide TV, you have to have hardcore evidence. Now, what evidence is it? I said, anytime a nigga in America can owe Bell Telephone 12 grand and they don't cut the phone off, it's tapped. You ought to see those letters I get from the phone company. Dear Mr. Gregory, y'all care to pay anything on the bills this year? Now, for those of you that really, they're going to start watching you, and all you heavyweights that really got something, you see, they try to get things on your sex life. Like in the early days of the civil rights movement, a lot of black leaders was upset because Hoover was trying to get dirt on us. Well, now, it didn't bother me. Well, let's see, if you got any sex film on me, one, you can't run it on NBC, and you damn sure can't send it to my house. So I couldn't care less what they had. Matter of fact, I used to take Jet and Ebony magazine and take out pictures of beautiful black women and mail it in to J. Edgar Hoover and say, if you can get any one of these three, I'll be in Cleveland for 2 weeks. If you can send any one of these to me, you can give the agent the night off. Just show me where the camera is, and I'll kick that button on myself. Now, here's the way they do it. Let's say, for instance, you're going into Washington, D.C. or Chicago, and they, in my schedule, they know where I'm going, and they will show up like a week. They'll show up like a week ahead of time. And they'll go into the hotel, and you know, FBI credentials scare the hell out of folks. They say, we're the FBI, Dick Gregory's coming in here, and we'd like to know what room you're going to give him. So we don't give out rooms till they get here. Well, tonight we want you to let us know what room you're going to give him. And they find it out, and they go in and put in what I wanted behind the mirror. I would take the CIA, because FBI agents is kind of square. And the least little bed movement upset them. You can hear them breathe. They put the mirror in the first hotel room when they started on me. Had to be a dumb CIA agent, because he put the mirror in backwards. And I laid in bed all night looking at him. Right? The second time I decided I was going to, you know, really trick them. And so I check into the hotel, and the government send the woman in, and about 2 minutes into his camera reel, I pop a smoke bomb, right? And that really wiped him out, you know. I can see his report now. He was smoking, right? One, I just meant the trick, but it ran him crazy, and if I had it all over to do again, I wouldn't. I never forget one night, I'm in the hotel, and I could hear the guy kick the camera on, and about 10 minutes into his film, I slipped a baseball bat out the bed. Well, I don't know what he thought it was, but it ran him crazy. He kicked a hole all the way through the wall. Matter of fact, he's no longer with the Bureau. He's just walking around the Washington Monument and saying, let me tell you about them black leaders. Let me briefly say to you that I wish, before you leave here tonight, you will look at this panel and you look around the room at all of you. And I hope you realize we live in a nation today of over 200 million people, of which 70 million people looked at the Super Bowl. This is the mentality of America. And this is what we're going to have to turn around. And it's very simple and it's very easy. We cannot waste our time getting hung up on worrying about who's a government agent and who's not, who's infiltrated you and who's not, because if your thing is clean, baby, you ain't got nothing to worry about. And if you're doing something illegal, hell, they'd bust you anyway. And so consequently, what we got to really depend on, because time's closing in on us now. Things is moving. John Doe Square is beginning to feel something. Folks out there in Gooseneck, Nebraska is beginning to wake up. And as things start closing in on them, naturally they're going to start moving in on us. But as long as you got truth and honesty and integrity on your side, there is no gun, there is no poison, there is no slick, degenerate system that's going to win. And I mean, I remember in the heat of the civil rights movement, we'd have rallies in church, and they wasting their damn time trying to figure out who's the sheriff and slipped in, who's the Ku Klux Klan. It don't make no damn difference. The fact that our meeting's so pure, the Klan would want to slip in it. I ain't never met nobody in the civil rights movement wanted to dress up and slip into a Ku Klux Klan rally. And there's a million people in this country that's really concerned that if we had the opportunity tonight to slip into the CIA headquarters, most of us don't even want to go there because there ain't a damn thing they got in the CIA headquarters that I want. Integrity is out here. Honesty is out here. And so this is what we have to depend on. They have all the money, all the slick electronics equipment. And it's very much evidence with the trial at Wounded Knee, the Chicago 7, the trial down in Florida. It's very much evidence that when the government can move in with all of their force and all of their money and all of their judges, and they still can't win one of them trials, that show you what truth and honesty and integrity can do. Now, if you're going to ever abandon that and want to get slick with them and want to stoop to the scroungy, low-down things that they doing, then you're going to lose, because that's their game, baby. The only thing that they cannot deal with is honesty. The only thing that they cannot deal with is truth. And so I say to you tonight that we haven't got much time. They're getting ready to bring this thing down because they don't intend to have an election in this country. We will determine, when we leave here, we will determine what's going to happen? You got to go home, you got to polish up your stuff, and you got to quit arguing with them fools. Don't nobody want to hear you argue about something. It's only natural for people to be frightened. It's only natural for people to be afraid. What you got to do is take the courage that you have, get your thing together so it's foolproof. We never could have won that whole war movement until people start doing their homework, until people start polishing up their stuff. And then we went out, and then we hit them with the truth, and we hit them with facts, and we've turned this entire country around. And we're dealing with a bunch of fools. These old flag-waving, sick degenerates, they ain't a damn, let me tell you how it works. All the folks that went to Canada and didn't want to go to war, all them folks that went to war and did everything them patriotic Americans told them to do, many of them laying up in VA hospitals tonight, not even being attended. And yet we get a president in the White House that decides, instead of creating some type of law to give the veterans that behaved themselves, that did what the flag wavers want, instead of creating jobs for them who need them, who've been raising hell, he created jobs for the draft resistors. He said, if y'all want to come back home, I got a 2-year work program for you. And if I come back home and work, you're going to feed me, you're going to give me a place to stay, and I know you're going to put a piece of change in my pocket. The work program should have gone to them veterans that behaved themselves and gone over there. So you're dealing with a dumb, insane, stupid, degenerate system. And it don't take that much. It's enough of us in this room tonight that if all of us got infected with syphilis before we left here, we could damn near wreck this whole country in a year's time. Now, if we can leave here with a negative and turn this country upside down, my God, what could we do with a positive? And so as I leave you, I say two things. I leave you tonight, I say two things. A very dear friend of mine, an old wise woman in Chicago, told me, she said, you know, Greg, there's a lot of water out there in that ocean, but it can never sink a ship till it gets inside. And I say that to you tonight. Those of you that's head over heels in this research, it will sink your ship if you let it get inside. You got to be 24 hours a day dealing with this, taking care of other things, dealing with this, taking care of other things. Don't let this information run you crazy to the extent, don't let it get you so uptight to where you're so damn evil and so damn ornery that your own mother, father, husband, or wife don't even want to be around you. What I'm trying to say to you is get all the information you can, get the knowledge and the wisdom and keep your integrity, but don't let it get inside to the extent that it's going to work against you. Now, I got a proposition I'm going to make to you, and we can break this thing open in the next 3 months. Now, this is going to sound stupid to a lot of you, but those of you, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand that's willing to do it, and those of you that don't think you can do it or not willing to do it, I want you to sit around and watch what you're going to see happen in this country in the next 3 months. I'll say to you tonight that if we can get enough people in this room that is committed. Now, I know there's some people in this room that would be willing to die to bust this thing open. I saw people in the civil rights movement that was willing to die for the struggle, but hell, if they got put in jail, they cry all night long. I'd rather be in jail than dead. And so I'm saying to you, I don't want y'all to die. I want y'all to live. If I can get a commitment tonight of a group of individuals that would be willing to fast 3 days a week and concentrate. Now, don't try to break this thing over out of evilness and out of hate, but out of love. I want to see this thing broken up, not because of hate I have for the CIA or hate I have for the people that's doing it, but out of the love I have for the millions of people that's going to be affected by this thing if it don't happen. And if we can break this thing open, then maybe for the first time America be willing to listen to somebody that don't have on a Brooks Brothers suit or a clean-shaven face or the right type of dress that we really believe represents integrity. This is what we got at stake. And if we can break this open, we will have the voice of the world, and we'll be able to deal with the Indians' problem. It'd be a hell of a thing to get enough power that when the church say to some Indians, if you pay me $750,000, you can have it, that we can come out of here with somebody emerging with the position that can get on television and say, all concerned folks in this country, we want you to send a minimum of $1 a piece, and all over that, let the damn church keep it since they so hung up for some goddamn money. And once we can do that, And once you can show that type of power, we can start dealing with the problems of poor people. We can start dealing with the problems of poverty. We can start dealing with the problems of old folks. We can start dealing with the problems of living in a damn country that talk about human dignity and rights, and we can't even get an equal rights bill pushed through for women in this country, and yet still we got a constitution that talks about all these things. This is what we can emerge with. So I leave you tonight by saying, if we can leave here and work from a standpoint of beauty, not a standpoint of ugliness and hate, it's amazing of what we can do. Now, those of you that are committing, I'll ask you to raise your hand in a second. The way the fast will go, 6 o'clock Friday night to 6 o'clock Saturday night will be the first day. Wait, I jotted it down here. 6 o'clock Friday, and those of you that's planning on doing it, write these days down for me. Let me raise your hand. How many of y'all are willing to fast 3 days a week? Okay, now I want you all in this room, keep your hands up. I want you all in this room to look at these hands, and I want you to see what's going to start happening. As you see it happen, then those of you that haven't committed, if you would start committing, not just with the hands we got raised in here now, you're going to see some things that's going to start happening within the next 30 days. For those of you that's going to commit, if you would write down and remember these dates, 6 o'clock Friday to 6 o'clock Saturday. And as you fast, don't drink nothing but fruit juice and water. And those of you that can go the whole day without anything at all, do it. 6 o'clock Friday to 6 o'clock Saturday. That's the first day. And just concentrate on all of this clandestine stuff and all of this vicious stuff that the CIA and the government agencies been doing is going to come out. The next day will be from 6 o'clock Sunday night to 6 o'clock Monday night. The third day will be from 6 o'clock Wednesday night to 6 o'clock Thursday night. And I guarantee you that within the next 10 or 15 days, those of you that's doing it, you're going to see something that's going to be so unreal and so unbelievable that this government, with all of its tanks and all of its slickness and all of its electronic surveillance, you see, if you get your book and understand the brain and understand the mind, you'll find out there's an electronic surveillance system inside that baby that have never been touched before in no damn computer or no damn machine. So as I leave you tonight, I say to you that as far as I'm concerned, you in this room hold the power and the faith and destiny. Will this thing come out or will they hide it? If they hide it, I can tell you one thing. 4 years from now, 80% of everybody in this country will be dead. And many of y'all in this room will be included. If we can bust this thing open, we might really have something to celebrate come July the 4th, 1976. May peace be with you, my friends. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Dick Gregory, an unscheduled speaker at this seminar symposium, sponsored by the Assassination Information Bureau. We're aware of some technical problems that we're having, and we're trying to work on those now. We should be getting a better signal than we did earlier. Dick Gregory calling for a national fast. Carl Oglesby is at the podium.
Donald Freed, whodunit?
Donald Freed, co-author
really
with
like
Plan
to
of
see
Executive Action.
Dick Gregory, if he'd take me up on it. But I will only take about half the time because my approach to this, to think to the end of the analytic road, is to think in terms of the structure of American power as it's really been from the beginning, and as I suppose it is bound to be in our kind of democracy until there are certain changes. And that is that when we say an invisible government or a secret government, if someone says who done it, and the answer is an invisible government, I think it's important not to reify or concretize that idea that it's a dynamic and changing idea. It's not necessarily a group sitting in one place. The conspiracy theory, it often hardens into an irrational point of view. But instead, to look at things structurally, I think. From the beginning, we've had a superstructure of rhetoric, of rights, of checks, of balances. It's electoral, it's political, it depends on the popular will. It's made up of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the Declaration. And then there has always been an infrastructure that is anti-democratic. And that, depending on the state of the industrial base of the nation at any given time, those aspects, that dimension of the infrastructure that cannot compete in the open market must always attempt to control the superstructure in order that it be subsidized. So that, for instance, in the Civil War, while manumission and the rights of man and slavery was the raging rhetoric of the superstructure, in the infrastructure there was a war to the death between the southern agrarian interests and the northern industrial interest. Later, you know, in the Gilded Age, in the superstructure, there was the great muckrakers of that period, while the oil and railroad consortiums who had to encompass an entire continent had to have and control and be subsidized by the superstructure. And again in the 30s, and again in the Cold War period, where the infrastructure, I think Peter Dale Scott puts this best of all in his writings when he describes about the connections between organized crime and corrupt unions, out-of-control intelligence components, and war industry, and the propaganda that flows from that. That infrastructure, that secret government of the 1950s, I believe, fell at Watergate. I really believe that is the dynamics of Watergate, the passing away of the Cold War secret government and its replacement by a new secret government, not one that depends on nationalism and chauvinism in the same way, not one that depends on war industry and anti-communism and an exterior enemy, but instead talks the language of peace and détente and internationalism, in short, the multinationals, the great consortiums who, robbed of any ideology, robbed of the anti-communism, that fig leaf and that rationalization for spilling American blood and squandering American resources, what had taken 25 years to expose and ventilate the Cold War anti-communist secret government took not 25 days for the energy crisis to become ludicrous in the eyes of most Americans who refused to blame Israelis, Arabs, or anybody else, but the oil companies. Not since 1900 has that happened. So what I'm saying is that though we can destroy one secret government, and it was destroyed, make no mistake about it, on the battlefields of Indochina in a dialectic with the movement here in this country. And what had been politics in the 1950s became paramilitary by the time of Watergate, and what had been propaganda in the 1950s became psychological warfare by the time of Watergate. And to use Hannah Arendt's definition, as power receded, violence increased. The conspirators found themselves denuded of that huge anti-communist popular base of the 1950s that had supported them. And as they found themselves alone, defeated on the battlefields, and that psychology and propaganda of the garrison state brought to its test and smashed in Indochina, that violence, as Fanon predicted in its third phase, turned back and ran home into the mother country. And the Cold Warriors, the Neanderthals, the hardliners, the secret government of the Cold War found itself against the wall and had to move violently and was moving towards a police state. And in the event, the public by that time had begun to hate the war more than it hated the war protesters. And that critical moment had arrived. And the center moved out to chop off its extremists just as they had in the days of Joseph McCarthy in the 50s. But it had been the left and the movement which had created the contradiction that had forced the center to move against the extremists. Now, that secret government, I believe, was defeated, and I believe that is why the CIA inquiries are opening up. And there is an attempt to save the dollar and save the system. And we find ourselves in an uneasy coalition and alliance momentarily with certain other forces whose intention is to move into that vacuum and gap with a new infrastructure. Well, we will part company when the time comes. Right now, I think, when we say who did it, we're saying, in effect, the secret government of the Cold War, which has now fallen from power and can therefore afford to be exposed by the media and by the Congress. They will let us, they will open the door to us while others are trying to undermine us and sabotage us. Other parts of the establishment are going to be opening the doors to us. That's the dialectic we face. And we have to go forward without any cynicism about it, and yet without any particular hope in these reforms in and of themselves. So without cynicism, but without hope, but instead with determination and stubbornness to practice our right to know and to try to teach millions of others to practice their right to know so that they will go on after this is over and expose the next infrastructure and the next one after that. And when that becomes a reality to the American people, at some point they will destroy that infrastructure or force it to be congruent with that superstructure, which is electoral and public. And I believe that the secret government, the lineaments of which began to bleed through in Watergate. And for one terrible moment, that visage was glimpsed by the public before the blinds were lowered and the curtain drawn by the media, the judiciary, and the legislature. But it bled through, and the blood-red footprints that go down this entire decade from Dallas to Watergate are there. Too many people have seen them. And if we go back and really organize, and we're going to come out of here tomorrow with very definite, concrete organizational ideas, if we really make a commitment now about our right to know and our need to know and to tell truth to power, even if the earth opens up at our feet, we will eventually be able to put names in those categories of organized crime and corrupt unions, out of control intelligence and war industry, aerodynamics, various industries, oil, those elements of capital which, finding they could not compete, resorted to violence. The price they will pay is that their idea of capitalism will be forever fractured and forever undermined, and the idea of capitalism will have begun its first transformation towards something else that is more human, and we will eventually be able to put names to those people, and then when it's irrelevant, send them to jail or try to save them from the gas chamber that the American public will demand for them. But it will be irrelevant by then, because they will be dead too. They will have politically passed away. They will have joined the people they murdered, both here and abroad, for the 25 years of bloodshed that they caused during that Cold War period, which really began with the Rosenbergs case, those terrible witch hunts and autodafés of the 1950s, and escalated in the 1960s, moved towards the center, and by the time of the White House had moved to an enemies list that ran right across the spectrum of American politics. They will be dead, we will be alive, and the American people will be alive in a way that they have not been since they were the people that could face the rigors of the Great Depression and the Second World War. They can stand the truth no matter how terrible it is, and we must tell them that. They know it. What they cannot stand are any more lies and cover-up. It has made the name America a nervous disease. It has bound us as a nation hand and foot, and it is the solution to these assassinations and the putting of names in those categories and the bringing of justice to bear that can begin a series of changes that at this point can continue far beyond our ability to encompass it at the moment. Thanks.
Penn Jones.
Penn Jones is a journalist from Texas, editor of the Midlothian Mirror, author of Forgive My Grief, volumes 1 through 4.
I'm a Texan, but I'm a shorthorn. I was born and raised in the northeast corner of Texas on a 50-acre cotton patch. We never had enough of food or enough shoes or enough. When we plowed up the cotton in 1932, we didn't have a cotton mattress in the house. I had one Sunday shirt. We had a neighbor family who had about 10 kids, and they were in the same shape. We only had 5 in our family. Finally, and the father died, and the old lady in her declining years, her children made enough money one year to take her on a vacation. They took her to Galveston. She took one look at that big ocean and said, "Thank God I've finally seen something there's enough of." I feel that way about this crowd here tonight. My God, I wish there'd been a picture out there to see these people waiting to get in. I started to work on this case on Sunday, November the 24th, 63, and for a hell of a long time, I didn't think there was anybody else working on this case, and I couldn't understand it. I was delighted when Mark Lane came down in 1965, and he filmed me on film at the Linotype for Rush to Judgment. I was a great success. It's unfortunate that the film wasn't shown anywhere. I feel sure by now I'd been in Hollywood if the film had been shown. I'm probably the oldest of this group. I'm 60, and if they get me tonight, they don't get too much. So I don't have time to wait. I don't have time to wait. I'm going to tell you who I think did it. Based on 11 years of work, and based on calling of some names that ought to be suing me tonight, if what I printed is not true, if they've got the guts to sue me. Edgar Eugene Bradley out in California sued 40 people in the name of John Doe. I sent him word, hell, you don't have to sue me in the name of John Doe. I printed your damn name in my paper. And unless he's filed suit in the last day or two, I haven't heard from him. I'll give you a few of the things on which I base my information. There are two people in Texas I must give credit to. They help me all the time. Unfortunately, based on the way we've been treated in the mass media, they do not want their names known. So I take the credit tonight for the work of three people in Texas who work all the time on John Kennedy. But the detour in the assassination area was unannounced, unnecessary, and I suspect all of you believe that it was unsecured. The rifle that Oswald used was defective. The firing pin was rusty. The sight was loose. The FBI wouldn't fire it until they tied the bolt down. Oswald was a poor shot according to Marine Corps records. All communications from the killing area in those vital few minutes after the shooting were cut off for a few minutes so they could decide what actually happened. Merriman Smith, the Pulitzer Prize winner, and the dean of the White House Corps, is responsible for one of those communications cut off. He yanked the phone, the only phone in a car, he yanked it out so it was inoperative. Smith did, though, try to make up for it later on. He committed suicide. The body was illegally removed from Dallas. It doesn't matter, though. If they could kill him in Dallas and get away with it, they could damn sure fake an autopsy in Dallas. The Washington autopsy was fraudulent. The single bullet theory is impossible. That is, unless you still believe in Santa Claus. The Zapruder film was never shown to the nation. Now the Zapruder and the Nix film confirm that there was a frontal headshot. And the Warren Commission knew this as of December the 16th, 1963, based on their own minutes, which you can now buy from the archive for 10 cents a page. The Warren Commission only questioned 189 out of 600 witnesses. We in Dallas are still finding, every time we get on a talk show in the Dallas area, we find new witnesses who were never questioned by anyone. We're recording them as much as we can. In order to pull people away from the killing area, a fake epileptic fit was pulled up on Houston Street by a man who fell to the ground, moaning and screaming and foaming at the mouth, and the sirens roared in and roared away with him, except when he got to the hospital, he got up and waved them goodbye and didn't even go in the hospital. Witnesses saw smoke come from behind the picket fence. You saw that film today. Witnesses saw smoke come from that fence. Witnesses also saw smoke come from the gutter area from which we believe the fatal headshot came. That witness who testified who stated to us about the smoke from the gutter area was a radio newsman on that Friday. He was a hero at his station that Friday night. He was fired Saturday morning for budgetary reasons by his radio station, and tonight he's running a pawn shop in Dallas to make a living. Other witnesses saw men escape from the back door of the school book depository building. Witnesses identified Oswald escaping in a different direction and by a different mode of travel than that stated by the Warren Commission. At least 4 policemen and 1 civilian ran into people with Secret Service credentials behind the picket fence up on the grassy knoll, and the Warren Commission never deemed it worthwhile to question. Wonder who those bastards were with those fake credentials back there. A Democratic president closed the archives, but we've had 2 Republican presidents now that haven't seen fit to open the archives. At least 2,000 names in those 18,000 pages, at least 2,000 of those names have been misspelled, and I think deliberately misspelled. I don't believe court reporters are normally that inaccurate. There are 2 things that you could do tonight to help in this fight. There were only 8,000 sets of the testimony printed. We got 10,000 libraries in this country. There's no way that we can inform 210 million people with 8,000 sets of books. Please demand of your congressman that they give us a massive reprint in paperback of the testimony and the exhibits, not the report. Hell, there have been millions of copies of the report printed, but they didn't underline in it when they were lying to you. 10% of the brain in this nation is tied up in the legal profession. 10% of the brain in this nation is tied up in the legal profession, and there are only 2 lawyers that are willing to talk about this case. 2 lawyers willing to talk about this case. Mark Lane and Jim Garrison, and both of them have been criticized and maligned beyond belief. I think it's time now for the vaunted American Bar Association to spend some of their talent and some of their millions to say to the American people, Jones, you're a goddamn liar, according to page so-and-so and paragraph so-and-so. But it hasn't been done. The Midlothian Mirror printed more on the assassination of John Kennedy than any other newspaper in the world over the last 11 years. And that, my friends, speaks volumes.
That was Penn Jones. He's publisher of the Midlothian Mirror in Texas, famous for the Penn Jones death list.
Richard Popkin. Richard Popkin.
Professor Richard Popkin. Professor of Philosophy at Washington
Well, so
University.
far, I
St.
don't know
Louis.
whether anyone's found out who done it, and I don't know whether you'll find out much more from me as to who done it. But I think I'd like to start first with reminding people that one of the people who's responsible and very seriously responsible for the reason we don't know who did it is the present President of the United States. When Mr. Ford became the President, when they listed his accomplishments, they very rarely mentioned that he was a member of the Warren Commission. He never brings it up. And if you look through the Warren Commission itself, through material about how it operated, that Ford was the hardliner at the Warren Commission, insisting on the one lone nut theory and the single bullet theory. And other members of the commission who were willing to admit to the possibility of a conspiracy were forced to back down by Ford in the final report. So the President is one of those who's helped greatly in keeping us from knowing very much. Another one who should be remembered is Leon Jaworski, who is going to head the Texas investigation of what happened in Dallas. One of the early meetings of the Warren Commission is on the problem of how to prevent Mr. Jaworski from doing this. And they do it by co-opting him as a special investigator for the Warren Commission, give him great thanks in the preface to the Warren Commission for his help. It's hard to find out what his help is. Maybe Penn Jones knows. But one interesting episode is that the late Jack Ruby had said that he wanted to tell people what he knew. He was afraid to tell them in jail in Texas. He begged to be flown to Washington, and instead, the late Earl Warren, President Ford, and Zavorsky go to see him in his jail cell and refuse to honor his appeal to get him out of the area, out of the jurisdiction, where he can tell what he had to say. Well, some of our great eminences have prevented us from knowing who did it. Secondly, I'd like to point out that if we knew a name, 2 names, 5 names, 10 names of people who actually played a role that day in Dallas, I'm not sure we'd know very much. Whether we could identify who these people are, or whether they amount to much of a meaningful explanation. By now, especially if people saw this presentation of the Zapruder picture today, have examined the medical evidence and so on, one believes that it couldn't have been done by one lone nut, that it took multiple number of people. But when we were challenged back in 1966 by a member of the commission, the late Allen Dulles, late director of the CIA, that if we didn't like the Warren Commission conclusion, bring in the killer, name him. And since we didn't do it, it was then taken as evidence we couldn't do it. Well, I don't think we're in a position right now to bring in the killer, name the name, and so on, but we're in a position to delineate what the interesting problems are, not whether we could find the name of somebody who otherwise is unknown in American history who actually fired the fatal bullet, but who ordered it, how was it organized, and why was it organized? And on this, I think we've moved a hell of a distance from the speculations 10 years ago to reasonably examinable possibilities in terms of evidence that may exist, that probably exists, and that might be forced out if Congress really cares in its investigations and if we're willing to make enough fuss about it. Speculations that were considered absolutely lunatic 10 years ago, that the CIA might have been involved, the FBI might have been involved, the mafia might have been involved, the big business interests might have been involved, all have turned out to be perfectly reasonable in that we now know many cases where exactly this happened, and cases that have been documented. In the period of the last 2 years, as Nixon's house of cards fell apart over the Watergate, we got a glimpse into what goes on. And we're getting more and more of a glimpse that focuses in certain directions that can be investigated and could fit in with what we know and could lead to a serious investigation of what documents exist, who might be able to tell us something more, and so on. What we've gotten a glimpse into is the sort of domestic intelligence agencies, especially in the FBI and the CIA, their role in committing violent actions, arranging killings, and some of the people who actually did this, like the director of the agency's domestic intelligence activities from 1962 to 1964, E. Howard Hunt. And it's interesting that in Hunt's book that he just published last fall, Undercover Memoirs of a Secret Agent, you learn absolutely zero as to what he did between 1962 and 64. The whole period is just skipped. Well, we now know, according to his statements, and I don't know what you can believe by now of his statements, that he was director of domestic intelligence, that he was using veterans of the Bay of Pigs, and they were engaged in conspiracies to kill Castro. We also know from a former friend of his, now in jail, Mr. Coulson, that Colson said that the reason he called Hunt the day Bremer was shot was Hunt was an expert on assassination matters, knew how these things were done, wanted to know what he thought had happened, and so on. We know that the government had people who could do it. We know they had agencies that could do it. Well, how does this help us with a particular case? Well, the particular case, most of us who've labored over it for the last decade or more have labored over the case the government set up, namely that the late Lee Harvey Oswald is the central character. Now, it may be the late Lee Harvey Oswald is a walk-on character. They picked him up at the last minute and put him into his role as the patsy, and a fantastic amount of effort has gone into finding out something that may not be at the core of the matter. But as Peter Scott showed yesterday and others have shown, that Oswald isn't just the man in Dallas. It's the name of somebody being used by CIA activities, turning up where it can't be the man who got killed in Dallas. And there's something mysterious about what Lee Harvey Oswald represents in the intelligence world of that period. I think we've also gotten some indication that what happened in Dallas was part of a continuous series of plots to kill Kennedy, one of which seems to have been related to Oswald's trip to Mexico on September 25th, one in Chicago on November 2nd, and the actual successful one in Dallas. We've also gotten indications, as was pointed out in the presentation of the Zapruder film, that there were backup teams in Dallas. That wasn't just one attempt, but a whole series were ready. If the first failed, then the second would have been tried, the third, and God knows how many. So this was a very complex affair, requiring very complex planning, and requiring the sort of planning that would need the type of expertise that domestic intelligence agencies had. The first two plots of September 25th and November 2nd coincide with important overseas CIA efforts. September 25th coincides with the overthrow of the Dominican Republic of President Bosch and the CIA plot there against Kennedy's hero in the Caribbean. November 2nd coincides with the killing of Diem in Saigon, so that the first two plots seem to be related to large changes in the world's affairs. If we could find out what the November 22nd one relates to, we might make some headway. All the evidence that surfaced about Oswald on November 22nd relates him to Russia. The earlier evidence that relates him to Cuba all seems to center around the Caribbean plot of September 26th. The fact that the whole cabinet, except for Robert Kennedy, was on a plane going to Japan that day, if we could find out why, one time in American history, they're all taking a trip to a very insignificant meeting, we might find out what sort of further plans were involved. Well, if we're getting structures and possibilities, are we in a position to actually find out something? And I think this is where groups like this can put the pressure on to demand that the congressional investigations really investigate, that we not be given another cover-up of a cover-up of a cover-up. There's no particular reason why a lot of data in the archives can't be shown to us. Things like Oswald's 1962 tax return, they do print a 63 return in the 26 volumes, but not a 62. And they tell you about 62 finances from a government handout about how sharecroppers live in the South on less than $3,000 a year, without ever discussing his actual case. If we could get his tax return, maybe we'd settle the matter once and for all that he was being paid by a CIA or some other sort of front, maybe the Mullen Company of Mr. Hunt or something like that, and that much would be settled. I think one of the most interesting documents that could tell us, from some of the people who probably know a fair amount about it, is the tape of May 15th, 1972, the conversation that went on for 4 hours between Nixon and Colson the day Bremer got shot, the day Wallace got shot by Bremer, when, according to Colson, they were discussing assassinations. And in the middle of all this, Coulson calls up Hunt, because he's an expert in assassinations, to find out what he knows about this one, and to send him out to Milwaukee, try and fudge the evidence on this one. This tape wasn't subpoenaed by the Judiciary Committee, by the Jaworski's office, but we've been told just a couple of days ago the government owns the tapes, but we're not allowed to hear them. But at least this one may be really relevant to what's gone on. If we could explore some of the plots we know that the FBI and the CIA were involved in to kill other heads of state, in which Hunt was involved, other people who surfaced in the Watergate were involved, the plot to kill the president of Panama in 1971, plot to kill Nixon in San Diego in 1972, that we'd find out the modus operandi of these people and then be able to see how much of this fits with what we know about Dallas. When Don mentioned the whole affair may go back to the Rosenberg case, I think we really have to go back a bit further, probably the Hiss case, which may be the beginning of using domestic intelligence to create the politics of the Cold War and the sort of history that we've had. And Hunt's own statements about the Hiss case are extremely suggestive that it is a put-up job, that he knows how it was done, and in his memoirs does explain how he did a similar case in Mexico 2 years after the Hiss case by faking a Chinese newspaper, getting it printed by the CIA and distributed to a couple of readers in Mexico, and then creating a crisis for one of the leaders of the Communist Party of Mexico because of what was in it. I think we're now in a position, from the Hiss case to the present, to delineate data, witnesses, examinations that could really settle things, and then, if somebody wants to know who done it, as Don said, by that time it may be uninteresting, but I think we could answer it, but I think at least we know the general structure of how it could have been done, and we're not fantasizing now, we're merely commenting on what has turned up in the investigations the last couple of years. So I think we really have to organize to force the data out, the witnesses on the stand under oath, and see where we are then. Thank you.
Here was Professor Richard Popkin from Washington University. He's author of The Second Oswald. Next to speak is Sherman Skolnick, chairman of Citizens Committee to Clean Up the Courts. He's been investigating official corruption and political assassinations, came up with that 2-year study on the plane crash which killed Dorothy Hunt. It's a microphone three.
Watcher. I have a distinct advantage that I live in Chicago. Some of my friends in Chicago feel we live at the center of the world. The CIA always seems to come home to Chicago. In 1968, they didn't have to spend any money to watch a CIA riot in the streets, provoked, set up by them during the Democratic Convention. We spent the next 7 years researching that. We produced the fact sheets, which some of you may have read, linking and showing and documenting how CIA money, their domestic operations department, handled that. It is now about to come out that E. Howard Hunt, who interests us greatly, was from 1962 up to just recently, not up to just 1966 as he contends, but up until just recently, the head of the covert department of the CIA's domestic operations and their subversion. And one of his offices was in Chicago and the other one was in Boston. So that ought to interest a few people. This has been confirmed by a reporter that I happen to have confidence in, a reporter who does not spy on other people, from a major paper in Chicago, and that paper, and that will not run what this reporter has confirmed, that E. Howard Hunt is probably one of the most important people in our time. His wife was also one of the most important people in our time. She went on a flight from Washington with an intermediate stop in Chicago. It is a flight that we've spent the last 25 months researching and investigating. We had an advantage that some of the researchers in the Dallas episode didn't have. In that episode, the Warren Commission succeeded in suppressing the key documents for the next 75 years. In the case of the plane crash where Mrs. Hunt died, United Flight 553, we reached a point in our investigation where we had to do something which we consider as patriotic. Patriotic to the extent that we ripped off the entire government file on the crash so that that Warren Commission, that is the National Transportation Safety Board, that Warren Commission is going nowhere. They can ridicule us all they want. The different networks can blank us out all they want. We have the facts. We've summarized the facts. Some of you may have read our fact sheet. We didn't bring enough fact sheets because, frankly, I didn't realize the great impact of the anti-assassination movement, but I'm sure the FBI understands that impact now, and the CIA. Now, that record which the government sought to suppress, which is now in our custody, which they've been confronted with, which they cannot deny, shows that that plane crashed not because of accident, because of sabotage. And there were upwards of 200 FBI agents waiting for that plane near the airport. Now that's one of those, what would you call it? A mere coincidence? Now some people, when they call in, when I'm on a talk show, they say, Skolnick, you and your friends are, like Alex Bottas, associate of mine, you are promoting the conspiratorial theory of history. I says, I am not. This is not a conspiracy. They says, well, that isn't so. I says, it is not a conspiracy because among the Rockefellers, the Percys, the Marshall Fields, the Mellons, the Morgans, and the other American royal families, they're in the assassination business every day. They do this type of thing every day, and among them and at their level, it is not a conspiracy. It's their everyday routine. After all, who owned United Airlines? Nelson and David Rockefeller and Senator Charles Percy. Can you find 3 people in this country that smile more or are shown to smile more on the 3 networks that they own, which is illegal for that group of people to own 3 networks? And that came out in a report by Senator Lee Metcalf last year, and I flung it in the face at a public hearing of the FCC in October, and nothing was done, nor did you see it on the air. Now, why did they have a motive to kill Dorothy Hunt, where she and her husband were a link between Dallas to Watergate to now? Because she was carrying a group of documents, some of which have fallen into our observation and custody. One of those documents should have been printed on asbestos because it was one of the hottest pieces of paper in the history of this country. It came off the CIA computer Walnut. If there's anybody here that knows what that type of printout is, the words were spaced out, which means a certain code was put in and other words were dropped out. If anybody knows about computer codes, you may understand what I'm saying about that. It was dated November 22nd, 1960, precisely 3 years before a certain other date that we've all been talking about the last couple days. The document said, and this was in the possession of Dorothy Hunt when she was on that plane. After the crash, by the way, it fluttered out of the crash zone on a wind and was stuck to a bush in the backyard of a little old lady that is not a CIA agent, that is not into politics, that thought it was just another piece of paper hung on her bush. And she, well, there might have been double. Sorry about that. I'm a little square. I didn't understand the double meaning, but I'm sorry. Well. That's because you're not a real show. All right. I can see there's a few here not thinking only researcher tonight. This little old lady saw to it by certain means that we get it. That document said that this is ordered by the National Security Council. It is a document, by the way, that is signed D.S. Eisenhower. D.D. Eisenhower, excuse me, President. It's dated as he was going out of office. after an election in which his vice president lost by way of 8,000 votes that Mayor Daley helped steal in Illinois to turn the Electoral College situation over to Jack Kennedy. The document shows that although Eisenhower was the president, the National Security Council, headed by Vice President Nixon, who was also the action officer for the Bay of Pigs, by the way, in the White House, the National Security Council ordered the president to sign this, and the document says that for the good of this republic, the following must be carried out. Number one, John F. Kennedy, and this was, 2.5 weeks after he was elected, should be removed. Number two, that certain other public officials should be dealt with. It further went on to point out that this should be immediately put into the National Archives. Now, don't ask me how Dorothy Hunt got this, nor can this document be confirmed. Supposing for the sake of discussion that E. Howard Hunt fabricated or reconstructed a document from known facts. He was an expert at it. He was, however, falsely described during the Watergate hearings as having fabricated State Department cables about the Ziem assassination. In fact, if you listen carefully to his testimony, he reconstructed that which somebody else had taken from the State Department files. Now, this document, together with $2 million, not $10,000, was in the possession of Dorothy Hunt. A very brilliant black network reporter, Michelle Clark, was going to do an exclusive story about the problem that this and Nixon and a few others were into. Some 43 people died in that crash. I haven't got time to go into all the details and facts that show it's sabotage. We have a few of our fact sheets left, and you can read the documented facts that are summarized there. We have the entire government suppressed file. They're not going to lock it up for 75 years. And that shows that that plane was sabotaged and why they'd want to kill Dorothy Hunt and 11 other people connected to Watergate. Now, that was a link that brought the Dallas matter up to date, because there are many behind this table here that believe that E. Howard Hunt was in one way or another involved with Dallas, that he was part of a group that was in the assassination business for the last 10, 12, 14 years. One of the ways to silence Hunt was to kill his wife, supposedly. However, they were known in espionage as a CIA couple. That is, a man and a wife that live together, are supposedly married and raise a family, but they're simply two agents that use that as cover. You realize the impact that that document was to be published in a major paper like the Boston Globe, which will never happen? Or on the network, which will never happen? Now, the incident that we got involved in investigating in Chicago was fortunate from our standpoint. Why? We haven't got the bread to travel that much. So the CIA made one major mistake. They crashed a plane right on the head of some researchers that would dig such a situation and go right into it, namely myself and associates of mine. You can damn well believe that the CIA is not going to sabotage any more planes over Chicago. In fact, the Mafia almost ran a plane into in their base in Virginia called Mount Weather. They got this little fight going, you know. In fact, this plane, Flight 514, last December 1st, TWA, crashed so hard into that large hill there where underground, which the CIA has got a lot of their facilities, that it put their electricity off for a while. So they have this little game. Now, if you come back and say, well, aren't you afraid to fly? Well, let me point out something to you, how I came here. I thought to myself, what is the safest way to come to Boston? I came here on United Airlines, okay? Sitting in the last row in the plane with my fact sheets in my suitcase. Maybe the plane crash, the tail fall off, we'll be okay, all right? All right. We sometimes joke about a very dismal matter. Now, I'm here to tell you that we have the proof, the documents. We are here tonight accusing the recent president of United Airlines, Edward Carlson, of murder. He and his predecessors, in August of 1965, covered up another plane sabotage, Flight 389, which had a deputy director of the CIA on board who wanted to talk about the Kennedy assassination, and that plane blew up 27 miles short of O'Hare Field and fell in Lake Michigan. So United Airlines has covered up more than one sabotage plane. I'm here to accuse Columbia Broadcasting System of covering up the details of the story that their reporter Michelle Clark was involved in. And when the case was coming to a head last fall of the parents of Michelle Clark versus the FAA and CBS, the key witness was a man named Herschel Latham, who was the mortician that was pressured into the immediate cremation of the body of Michelle Clark over and above the wishes of Michelle Clark's parents. Herschel Latham began grumbling to some of his closest friends that it was only he and a few FBI agents that saw the body of Michelle Clark. There was no physical reason for that immediate cremation. The body was not disfigured. He was murdered in his home last fall. It's another one of those natural, unconspiratorial situations that's been happening too often from Dallas to Watergate to now. I can go on and tell you about the witnesses that have been ripped off in one way or another. I'm more careful these days in mentioning witnesses. I have to. CBS covered that up. I'm accusing them of covering up this murder and others. And the FBI tried to cover up the reasons why their 200 people were waiting for that plane. And the acting director of the FBI, Mr. Ruckelhaus, in June of 1973, in a document that came up before the Brooks Committee, the Government Oversight Committee, admitted, after 7 months of denials, that he had 50 people there. Well, that's very helpful. Now, if the present director will only admit the other 150 people. The FBI committed outrages against those that supposedly were victims of that crash. They loaded them into body bags without medical attention and did not allow a Roman Catholic priest that came to give last rites to give the last rites. We have the testimony of a doctor that came and wasn't allowed to attend. We go on and on with that. There are very, very many details. The Chicago Strike Force of the Justice Department, they covered up the details that came out in part through the prosecution of a stolen securities racket, the Joseph Sorelli mob. And in the trial transcript of that case, if it didn't burn like tomorrow night, would be shown a suppressed government FBI document that we got into the court record showing that the FBI knew that Mrs. Hunt was carrying $2 million that she blackmailed out of the CIA and Nixon with this group of very hot documents that she was carrying. Last but not least, we come back to the owners of United Airlines, Nelson and David Rockefeller and Senator Charles Percy. They're involved in the cover-up of this murder, a murder that links from Dallas to Watergate to now. I wouldn't link my name to these accusations unless I was certain of the proof that we have. You can imagine the impact if the people actually owned CBS Network instead of the Rockefellers, the Mellons, the Morgans, and the rest of them. And if we were talking on the air tonight, what would happen? The whole thing would make a U-turn tomorrow, wouldn't it? No, I'm not about to write Senator Percy. He's from my home state. No, I'm not about to write Walter Cronkite. In fact, when the major newspapers that lied about this case of the death of Dorothy Hunt, and the major broadcasting companies, when they come to interview me or to put their microphone in front of me, I say, I haven't got time. I'm on the way to Boston to Assassination conference. I will not talk to you. Will you please print the same lie you printed last year, and please spell my name right this time? Just print the same lie you printed last year. If you print a new lie, I'm going to have to spend time dealing with it. I think we all realize that this is the moment of truth for this government, which is an illegitimate government, which is run in the broad sense by the Warren Commission through an unelected president that was a member of that infamous group, through Leon Jaworski, who just left his position, and a former staff member of Jaworski's special prosecuting team confirmed that they knew that the CIA and others had been murdering one after the other of key Watergate witnesses that the public has not been told about, except by those of us that dare stick our neck out and speak about it. So the same pattern of assassination of witnesses of an assassination that researchers have found in respect to Dallas is going on now in respect to this plane crash. Pilots of United Airlines in the beginning condemned me because their morale required that they condemn me. How could they continue flying if this type of thing was covered up? But recently, a growing minority of those pilots sent what amounts to be a spokesman of their group to my house to tell me that they dig what we're doing and that they too believe that United Airlines helped cover up a murder. Murders in the plural. I understand that a very brave United Airlines stewardess got up at a company meeting and accused the management of murder. Yes, she was dismissed right away. No, it wasn't on the evening news. So you see, the thing we've been talking about these 2 days is happening now. It's not just 11 years ago. I'll probably go back on United Airlines. And heaven help them if a water cup so much as falls on me while I'm sitting in the last row of the plane, right? Or the engine backfires or flames out in air or something like that. It'd be an international incident, right? While United Airlines official came around the side of the plane when we landed at Logan Airport to personally take my wheelchair up the special gangway to the jetway so that I wouldn't have to wait for my wheelchair. And if that didn't work, the present president of United Airlines would do it himself, if I'd only agree next time not to go on his plane. So that's what's happening from those of us from Chicago. I don't think they're going to crash any more planes in Chicago. They may crash another one like they did at Logan that had a CIA agent on it, and his suitcase conveniently was found on the runway. I'm not from Boston. I wish somebody from over here would look into it. But that's the link from Dallas to Watergate to now. I'm not here to praise the memory of Dorothy Hunt. I'm here to tell you she was a very important person. I'm here to tell you that I feel that her alleged husband, E. Howard Hunt, probably is about to be wiped out to silence this link. But there is hope as long as you will come and listen and think about it and start asking questions.
Sherman Skolnick, I think it's fair to say that Skolnick represents the fringe of political assassination theorists. Next up, I believe, will be Mae Brussell. Mae is one of the better-known researchers into domestic clandestine activities, and she's published in The Realist, and she's now working on a book. Mae Brussell.
Thank you. The name of my 5 or 6 minutes, maybe 8, is called J'accuse. It took Emile Zola that long. I call J'accuse because you want to know who did it, and you won't know these names. I'll rattle them off fast, but in Washington, let them ask me to come there or let them investigate these names and prove me wrong. You want to know who did it? Let's rattle them off. I'll give you a few. Now, in the Watergate, who did it? 5 men at the Democratic headquarters, Hunt and Liddy in the hall, or Baldwin across the street? Or was it our Defense Intelligence Agency? Some did it, some covered it up, some received the messages, some funded it in Mexico. So I'm not going to give you 500 names. I'll give you about 30 or 40 tonight to chew on. Number one, as far as the funding, it has been alleged that Mr. Bloomfield in Montreal, the head of Permindex Corporation, funded this assassination series of the two Kennedys and King. They can check Mr. Bloomfield out. Captain Fritz of Homicide in Dallas, Texas, had 10 agents that day that were home or at a restaurant for lunch who, after Kennedy was killed, turned off their TV and picked up the gun behind the boxes, or met Mrs. Markham, or they picked up boxes in Marina Oswald's garage and put in the trunk of their car and brought it back the next day with planted evidence. These 10 men, and they went to Lee Harvey Oswald's rooming house, and they got some more evidence, planted evidence there. So those 10 men under Captain Fritz were directly involved. Alan Dulles of the Central Intelligence Agency was directly involved. He had 30 agents or more in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that he used, and along with his employee, E. Howard Hunt, working hand in hand ever since the early days, and also Richard Helms from the days of Adolf Hitler, working with Alan Dulles. They were directly involved in the Kennedy assassination. Who supplied the motive? Those 30 people I mentioned in my session today in the Dallas-Fort Worth area who were agents of Alan Dulles. I'll give you their names. George Bowie was the contact man of the Central Intelligence Agency, the head of the Greek Orthodox Church. Max Clark was directly responsible, the chief of security of Convair, who was the first person Lee Harvey Oswald called when he got back in Fort Worth. Lydia Dmitrik was directly involved and knew Lee Harvey Oswald at a hotel in the Soviet Union. And George and Jean de Mohrenschildt were his babysitters from the CIA who planted the evidence in the story that Oswald even knew there was a rifle in that area. He never saw it, he never touched it. De Mohrenschildt planted that story. Declan Ford and Kathy Ford were responsible for much of the cover story, and then Everett Glover and Peter Gregory, Elena Hall, John Hall, Mrs. Harris, Alex Kleiner, Ilya Mamontoff, Anna Miller. She was at Marina Oswald, had her name in the Soviet Union before she arrived in Dallas. Michael and Ruth Payne were directly involved in the conspiracy. Michael's dead now. Jacques Hughes, Ruth Payne, agent number 1 or 2. Paul Regatorodsky, Ray Frank, Ray Thomas, Natalie Ray, Igor Voshinin, Mrs. Voshinin were all involved in framing Oswald. I spent 8 years with every motive the Warren report said he had. He couldn't earn a job. He didn't like his wife. He beat his wife. He was meaningless. He wanted a place in history. I took every one of these people and traced the origin of where they came from, and none of what they said was true about Lee Harvey Oswald. Jacques Hughes, Frank Sturgis is part of E. Howard Hunt's cover-up. Warren Carroll of the CIA, who was in charge of Jack Ruby up to the time that Jack Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald. Let Warren Carroll come forward, and let's see where he is today. William Sullivan of Division 5 of FBI was the contact man with J. Edgar Hoover for these assassinations, and he reappears at the Watergate through the Watergate hearings, and when the hearings got hot, Sullivan went to a hospital with a heart attack. He's coming out now as a flaming liberal that we have to watch the FBI or we'll have a police state. Let him step forward and answer questions under oath about the Kennedy assassination. And Marina Oswald, agent of Lee Harvey, she was his mate, like Dorothy Hunt. She wasn't his wife. I talked about that this morning. No one attended the ceremony. The proposal came in a hospital after they'd met 3 public times. This assassination team has names. They are not an amorphous group. After 8 years' work, I did a diagram which I can read you names so that you know they can be identified. They're walking the streets. They're not something we don't know about. Frank Capell of Army Intelligence, he knew that Robert Kennedy was sleeping with Marilyn Monroe, so when his brother was killed, he could say, "You are cut off, you can't do anything." And Marilyn was killed shortly after John Kennedy's death. And Frank Capell, through their dirty blackmail of J. Edgar Hoover, had Bobby Kennedy by the balls. So our Attorney General saved his own face instead of serving his country. And he never spoke up because both John and Bobby were sleeping all over the country. I have a friend, a movie producer, whose home they used, John used. The Secret Service circled, they called down, he vacated, the house had an electric gate, he's a screenwriter, and he'd shack up. And J. Edgar Hoover knew all of that and arranged it. And with Bobby, the same story. So people say, why don't the Kennedys do anything? He couldn't revive his dead brother, and they had the goods on both of them. And their extramarital relationships and the disgrace to them came before his acting as our Attorney General. And he was tied, and Frank Capel wrote a book on the strange death of Marilyn Monroe. I have it, and that's what he had on Bobby's relationship and all the intricacies of the Marilyn Monroe death. There's a new book out, there's 2 books out, it's all true. Every bit of it is true, and they had the Kennedys by that. They had Bobby Kennedy as Attorney General. Frank Capel is at the top of my list because he held the Attorney General into silence, and therefore he was important, and under him was J. Edgar Hoover, who controlled Bobby Kennedy. Then Bobby, the Attorney General, should control Hoover, but it was the other way around. And under this diagram is Richard Helms and Allen Dulles of the CIA. And then Marina Oswald was meeting with specific agents. They have names: George de Mohrenschildt, the Paynes, the Mamontovs, and the Gravitas. And she was meeting separately, framing the man that she had as a mate who gave her the citizenship in this country, who came over with her. Oswald is an agent of the FBI doing his work on assignment, need-to-know basis, met with Mr. Gregory, Clark, Bowie, Miller, de Mohrenschildt, and Payne. As I say, I'm reading these names off, but I'm giving you the summation of 11 years of research. They have faces, they have IDs, they have jobs, and they can be called in at any time we want them, because they were all involved. And Marina Oswald met separately with the oil operators, the oil engineers, through the Mamontovs and Graffices, to the most anti-Semitic, the most racist, neo-Nazi team named Volkmar Schmitz and Betty McDonald and Mr. Fredrickson and Glover. And then they met with Jack Crichton of military intelligence and the motorcade and Mr. Holmes, the postmaster, and Lawson of Secret Service, who had the last say. He stepped out of the room while the motorcade was decided. And Marina was working with the military oil operatives, and they protected her afterwards, and she's been cushioned in their lap ever since. And on a need-to-know basis, away from Marina Oswald with these people and the oil operators and the motorcade, there was the extreme right wing, General Walker, and Mr. Hunt down there, and Lifeline. Mr. Warren Carroll wrote Lifeline. And there was a team called CUSA that came to Dallas, from Munich, Germany, American men in military intelligence from Munich, Germany. And the first one who came there went from New Orleans into Dallas-Fort Worth area and formed the Young Americans for Freedom, which that year was founded by William Buckley and Douglas Caddy, who's known in the Watergate, who worked for Mullen Associates. And they took Kennedy's flame, his flag, the signal of his new regime when he lit that flame when he was inaugurated, and said, let this flame go forward. And Young American Freedom took that flame on their stationery, and they moved into the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Larry Schmidt, Bernard Weissman, Larry Jones, Bill Burley, Robert Schmidt, and Mr. McDonald. Not one of them was called as a witness before the Warren Commission. And Mr. Grinnan and Mr. Hunt and Birchwell and Surrey were involved with General Walker. And then the black money, the killing money, came from the Republic National Bank. Check that out. Connie Trammell was the agent. She was in Mr. Hunt's offices, the oil man, Wednesday before the assassination, as was Jack Ruby. And Ruby owed $40,000 to the Internal Revenue before the assassination. When he died, he didn't leave any debts. And Bernard Weissman and Burley, and these groups all were tied to the Republic National Bank, the black money, the killing money. And into Houston, where the money for the Watergate came. The Mexican money that was washed and came up through Houston to the Republic National Bank. Connie Trammell and Jack Ruby, and Frank McGee and the National Indignation Committee, and a Clyde Moore and a Ken Thompson and Dale Davenport of the YAF. I have a list of people from the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I drew 2 diagrams, the chain of command of the extreme right-wing military oil people to the motorcade, and another one on the espionage relationship of Lee and Marina Oswald. So when you want to know who did it, they are not amorphous, they're not people. I'm not going to get up and give a speech and say, well, we know it was, we've heard a lot tonight about the FBI and the CIA. These are their names. They have names. I have cross-filed them 11 years. And one more thing, I'll just run down a few things about E. Howard Hunt and then I'll quit, because I wrote about him in that first published article I did from Dallas to Watergate, and I'll give you a few points. E. Howard Hunt was chief of covert action, you've heard. He admits from 62 to 66 for Domestic Operations Division. E. Howard Hunt, at the same time, was acting stations chief in Mexico City for 2 months. He had 2 jobs, in Mexico and domestic, in August and September, when Albert Osborne, alias John Howard Bowen, was sitting on the bus with Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico, and Osborne was with Hunt in Mexico, and David Ferry and Shaw, and all the majors that ended up in Dallas in the conspiracy. 2 months later, with E. Howard Hunt down in Mexico. He took his domestic work to Mexico for 2 months out of all those years. Now, isn't that strange? When all those people were in Mexico. Now, in 1962 to 63, E. Howard Hunt was writing a book for Allen Dulles, the chief of our entire intelligence agency that formed the CIA. And then Allen Dulles was on the Warren Commission. He was removed from the CIA because Kennedy said there's a hidden government behind my back, and he was put back on the Warren Commission. Now, when the Warren Commission met, and I have the minutes of their meetings, Allen Dulles came to the commission, and he said, gentlemen, I have a book here on a history of assassins, their personalities, their profiles, and there seems to be a pattern running through here. Oswald meets these other assassins, their traits, his personalities, what we know as a psychological profile. Well, I wrote in about 1966 to John J. McCloy, and I said, I'd like a copy of that book on assassins that you got at your first meeting. And he wrote back, we never got a book. And I wrote to Senator Cooper, and I said, at the first meeting of the Warren Commission, Allen Dulles brought you a book. I was studying assassins, I'd like it. He said, we never received that book. Now, I had the minutes of their meeting. I wrote to all of them, and I didn't get an answer from Gerald Ford. He didn't answer me, and Lee J. Rankin didn't answer me, and the archivist, Mr. Angel, wrote back that there never was such a book, but I have the minutes of the meeting. So if E. Howard Hunt was writing for Allen Dulles in 62, couldn't he have written that book? I knew then it was a fake book. And I think E. Howard Hunt wrote that book, and I want them to account for that if he was writing for Allen Dulles. Then E. Howard Hunt admitted last week that he was writing in domestic work. He was working for a publisher called Prager Publishing Company in New York. And they have a branch in Washington, and they said we did 15 or 16 books for the CIA. Now, wouldn't it be funny if one of those books was the one that went to the Warren Commission? The CIA, wouldn't that be funny? See how this is all coming together now? Did they publish a book that nobody else saw except he gave to the Warren Commission? And they lost their memory within 3 years about that book? If E. Howard Hunt was the chief of covert actions from 62 to 66, working with publishers, writing for Allen Dulles, and Dulles is bringing it to the meeting, and the book doesn't exist. Let's find out what E. Howard Hunt was doing with that publisher. That's one example. And I have about 40 examples of E. Howard Hunt and his involvement from Dallas to Watergate, and I don't want to take time going through them now, but maybe later Sunday, if any of you are interested, I'll show you the importance. But that book publishing thing is significant because I caught on in 66, and I have a whole series of these letters from them denying it, plus the minutes of the meeting. Now we find Hunt was writing a book. He wrote for Allen Dulles. He was in Dallas with the assassins. But when you say who did it, do you mean the 4 or 5 gunmen that got away? Do you mean who covered it up? We know. These men are modest. Some don't go out on a limb like I do. Those of you that hear my radio show every week, I go way out on a limb. I name many people every week, 20 or 30 if I have 45 minutes to do it. You know I do. And I think it's time that we stop thinking that they can't be arrested and said under oath what they were doing. They can, and let's get to it and make them produce these people.
Good old Mae Brussell. And if we follow the program, I see we will, Peter Dale Scott is next, author of The War Conspiracy, has been researching the Dallas to Watergate links, and he's currently working on a manuscript called The Dallas Conspiracy.
Some of you have heard me 2 times already in the last 3 days, and we're trying to get a panel discussion going here later, so I really am going to try and be frivolously short with this very serious question, who done it? And although in the end I don't really know, as a professor I can always talk for as long as I like about something I don't know. I'll give you a big answer first and then a much more pointed answer. The big answer is, if you heard me this morning, I was talking about the Gray Alliance as a system in this country between business, politics, organized crime, and now more recently intelligence agencies tied in. I was trying to lay out how you get a system going for the governing of, say, a city like Chicago, and then also the same system can be exported to an area like the Caribbean, or more recently now in Vietnam. Some of you know that I really began by being interested in Vietnam and baffled by this sudden change in U.S. policy and the reversal of Kennedy's first disengagement decisions in late '63, the reversal of that, the very significant reversal on November 24th, 1963 in the form of NASM 273. I've written about that elsewhere. And then I got interested in this Asian gray connection between Chinese nationalist intelligence and the Asian People's Anti-Communist League and the narcotics traffic, which I wrote about in The War Conspiracy. And a name that turned up there was one of their American correspondents, a man called Spas T. Riken, whom incidentally I don't think did it, but was one of their correspondents. And I said, I've heard that name before. I've heard that name before. And about 6 months later, I was reading the Warren Report again and saw that he was the man who had met Lee Harvey Oswald when Lee Harvey Oswald came back as a disgruntled loner from the Soviet Union. And I said, really, I'd better look into this a little bit more. And I found it very interesting indeed. Now, the big answer, I think, is the Gray Alliance. But if you want to name names, all I can say is, I don't know who did it, but I do believe, as in the case of Watergate, let's begin with the cover-up and ask certain people questions, and when we get their answers, maybe we'll begin to peel off the layers of the onion, and we'll get back to what really happened. So all I have ever studied in Dallas really was the cover-up. And I do know who was controlling Marina Oswald's very important testimony in the first days after the assassination. It is a very strange story indeed, which I can't tell the details of you now, but to tell you who it was, she was spirited away by the Secret Service for 36 hours. Even the FBI couldn't find her. They had already made a reservation for her on the morning of November 24th before 11 o'clock at a place called the Inn of the Six Flags, owned by the Great Southwest Corporation, which is my chief focus for study and the people who should ask further questions. And let me just say parenthetically that there's a contemporary relevance to the Great Southwest Corporation, because it went on to figure in the two largest bankruptcies in the history of the United States, and for all I know, in the history of the world, the failure of the Zeckendorf, Webb and Knapp empire, and then more recently, the failure of the Penn Central, which meant that there was a House Banking Committee investigation. They pointed to the Great Southwest Corporation as a prime factor in that, and they named the people who in 1963 were the chief shareholders, who tightly controlled the Great Southwest Corporation. They named them the Wynn family in Dallas, the Rockefeller brothers in New York City. So let's find out what they were doing, their employees were doing with Marina Oswald's testimony. First of all, if those of you who know the story, Marina Oswald was given a manager of her affairs, namely the manager of the Inn of the Six Flags, and it was he who made such gifts to American history as selling Life magazine, the photograph of Oswald with a rifle in one hand and the militant in another hand, and a pistol here, and maybe, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And he was fired. And it looked as if that was the end of the Great Southwest Corporation and Marina Oswald's history, because a new lawyer came in and said, "Get out of here, James Herbert Martin," and it looked like there was a dispute. But the new lawyer was a man called William A. Mackenzie, and he had been, until very recently, a law partner of Bedford Wynn, who was one of the chief members of the Wynn family who owned the Great Southwest Corporation. And Wynn, Jaffe, and Tinsley, with Mackenzie in the firm, were the lawyers for the Great Southwest Corporation, until Mackenzie resigned, and I've been told he resigned in order to become Marina's lawyer. He behaved very strangely, and he can quite properly be called to account for the way in which he behaved. There were 2 witnesses who testified under oath that he coached Marina as to what to say to the FBI. And they recalled him telling her to testify about the gun, that there were 2 guns, but there was only 1 gun that was used. We actually have an FBI memorandum of Marina's testimony where she says exactly what 2 witnesses said under oath Mackenzie coached her to say. And not only that, there was the whole crazy story about the day that Lee Harvey Oswald went out to shoot at Richard Nixon and Marina. Oswald locked him in the bathroom. Well, they had to change that story. You don't lock people in bathrooms, you lock them out of bathrooms. And they checked the lock, and indeed, like all bathroom locks, it was on the inside, not on the outside. So Marina changed her story. She was pregnant at the time. She had held him inside the bathroom all day by holding 1 foot here, 1 foot here, and her hand on the doorknob. And then they said, no, that really won't work. So there was a 3rd version. This is the one that got to the Warren Commission. It wasn't all day. They just struggled for a few minutes inside the bathroom. We have the documents of every single one of these versions. And the story is junk. Don't worry about it. Even the Warren report discarded the story. What's interesting is who corroborated the story. Well, in order for it to be credible, Nixon had to be invited to Dallas. And a man called Carlson came forward and said, oh, yes, I invited Richard Nixon to come to Dallas. And then the FBI interviewed Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon corroborated the story. Yes, I seem to remember being invited to Dallas sometime probably in April, which was the right time. It was good corroboration. And then what is most important, this is where the law comes in. Marina's lawyer told the Warren Commission, he volunteered it. He said, I remember when Richard Nixon was coming to Dallas at the invitation of Mr. Carlson. Well, the funny thing is that Mr. Carlson never invited Richard Nixon to come to Dallas, as he knew how badly the story was going because he happened to be the president of an insurance firm where the Winnies were very prominent. And the secretary of his insurance company was a man called Henry Baer, who was William Mackenzie's law partner and sat in every one of these interviews with Marina Oswald. And the very day that she really blew it, I think it was the day when she had 1 foot on each side of the door, Mr. Carlson wanted out, and he told the FBI, I remember now, I never invited Richard Nixon to come to Dallas. It was Barry Goldwater. Well, if he never did it, how did William Mackenzie remember Richard Nixon being invited to come to Dallas by Mr. Carlson? That is a statement to a U.S. government agency. And if you make a false statement to a U.S. government agency, under oath or not, you are guilty of a felony under 18 United States Code paragraph 1001, I think. I'm not a lawyer up here, but that's what is 1001. Okay. Well, as these may seem like technicalities to you, it's not the big picture, it's the very small picture. But I have always believed that if we are going to get the big picture, we have to keep hammering away at the small picture, at the details. We have to be able to put it back to these government agencies. Here are where people said things that are not true, and it is up to you to go back to those people and get them to explain now, how come you weren't telling the truth about these things way back 10 years ago? And I think not just, as I said yesterday, it's not just enough to put the pressure on Congress. Obviously, one has to put that kind of pressure on Congress, but we're going to have to tell them what kinds of questions to ask. We're going to have to find the stories which were false and the people who gave the stories which were false. And I don't have more time here now, but I do want to say that I think will turn out to be very contemporary indeed. I'll just close by saying that in 1963, I think this assassination had a lot to do with Cuba and a lot to do with Vietnam. And it's true that there were cowboys who were very upset with Kennedy's policy in these areas. There were also some Yankees who were very upset with Kennedy's policies in these two areas. It was Drew Pearson who said in February 1963 that Nelson Rockefeller was the man behind Senator Keating's campaign to organize Congress against Kennedy on the Cuba issue. It was Nelson Rockefeller in October 1963 who said he was utterly opposed to the new talk about getting out of Vietnam. What we had to do was get in and make a stand there. And it's quite clear, I think, that Nelson Rockefeller and Richard Nixon together they carried the ball. They were the most vociferous opponents. Goldwater was a kind of buffoon. He was entertainment. But these two men, Rockefeller and Nixon, were deadly serious in 1963. And I'm not now talking about who done it. I am going back to the big picture of what was happening in this country in 1963, and there was a rift appearing in the power structure of this country, and as I say, a rift which was temporarily sealed over when the new administration, 2 days after the assassination, made the commitment, which had been such an issue, to go in and fight in Vietnam. And that, for me, is why the assassination has always been such a desperately serious matter, not only for us who live in America, but for all those in the world who have to worry about America's posture in the world. Thank you very much.
And our last panelist, Mark Lane.
It's quite late, and you've been very patient. And I spoke at great length last night and also on a panel today, so I'll be very brief now. There are, that we know of, two major crimes related to November 22nd, 1963, one crime being the assassination, and the other crime being the cover-up of the assassination. The cover-up was massive in many respects. In one respect, in retrospect, it was really startling because we saw a cover-up executed by the chief executive of the United States. A chief executive which during the latter part of this century assumed greater power than the chief executives previously had in the history of this country. I remember way back when Franklin Roosevelt was president, if he went into a restaurant and there was a member of the United States Supreme Court in there, it was a scandal if one of them didn't leave at once. That was the feeling about the necessity of co-equal branches of government, the executive, the legislative body, and the judiciary. It got to be a point toward the latter part of this century where there was, in fact, one branch of government. The chief executive, the executive branch, legislative branch did almost nothing. The chief executive wanted the power to wage war and wanted Congress to yield that. Then there was a Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and all the power went to the executive. And there was no control of the war by the legislative branch. But the culmination of that was when it was necessary to convince the American people that Oswald was a lone assassin, in which the executive, in order to have a report issued on behalf of the President of the United States, he compromised the judiciary by securing the chairmanship of that commission for the Chief Justice of the country, and he compromised the legislative body by securing two of the major leaders of the House and the Senate, two Democrats and two Republicans. In that fashion, when the report was issued by the executive, it was a report on behalf of the legislative body and on behalf of the judiciary as well. And it was the entire government speaking in behalf of a report which we know now, which many people have known for a long time, to be a totally false document without any redeeming qualities whatsoever. Now, the question is, who did it? Who did the cover-up? We know that. We've known that for more than a decade. We can call the names of the members of the commission, including the present president and the former president who appointed them, and the networks and the news services and the others who endorsed the report often because of the work done by the national police organizations in terms of explaining the responsibility to the media to be irresponsible. That's obvious now. It's been obvious for some time. In terms of who actually pulled the trigger, who organized the program, the assassination of John Kennedy, I don't believe that the evidence is available to draw a sound conclusion at the present time. I don't believe that. I don't believe there anybody here or anywhere else who we know has the kind of evidence that any of us would want to walk into court with and try to present to a jury. Nothing close to that. I think the stance we should choose is somewhere between paranoia on one hand and the complacency which has gripped this country for 11 years on the other hand. Someplace in terms of a reasonable, hard-working study of all of the evidence. And no matter how hard we study that evidence, I believe that we will not be able to determine who killed John Kennedy by ourselves, because we do not have the power that the apparatus of government has. We cannot subpoena Mr. Hunt, who indeed has done a number of very interesting things, which we discussed last night and other places and other times. A number of very interesting things. And there must be hundreds of questions that occur to anyone familiar with the body of literature and evidence and information that should be put to Mr. Hunt. But none of us here can do that because he won't answer us. It has to be a method. We have to find a method to force the apparatus of government to function on our behalf, which it has so rarely done in our 200-year history. I think it can be done, though, possibly. I think if ever it could be done in the last 11 years, this is the time that it can be done. We know now that Congressman Gonzalez yesterday announced that he believes that the evidence is conclusive. He's a congressman from San Antonio. He was closely related to the motorcade, told me a week after the assassination that he told John Kennedy not to go through Dallas. He said, I wouldn't go there myself. It's not safe. He said, John Kennedy turned to him and said, Henry, the Secret Service has told me not to worry. They have arranged the greatest security precautions in the history of the country. I saw Henry Gonzalez a week after the assassination, and documents which he had secured had been stolen from his own office. He's been suspicious of a lot of this for a long time now, naturally. Now he has said, for the first time publicly, reported not in all of the newspapers in the country, but in the San Antonio press, that he will introduce legislation demanding an investigation into the cover-up and into the facts surrounding the assassination of John Kennedy, and that he said he has talked to Peter Rodino, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, and that Rodino is most responsive to that approach at the present time. I don't have a lot of faith in that operation, I should say at this point. But I have faith in our ability to force that apparatus to work. And I would rather not see them start their investigation now. I would rather see us put together the kind of activity that, first of all, educates everyone that we can reach. Lectures all over the country, colleges, unions, articles, appearances on radio and television by not one or two or three of us, but by scores of people going out to raise the level of consciousness in this country. That's a small portion of it, but a portion of it. Then the effort of organizing college students and trade unions and all kinds of people and all kinds of groups all around this country to demand that there be a serious investigation. I think that tomorrow we're going to see for the first time really a petition which will be available to us, which will begin to address the will of the American people to the members of those committees of the Congress and of the Senate that have this responsibility. I don't know of a single committee in the United States Senate in the last 25 years which was more likely to be responsive to us in this area than the Select Committee established now under Frank Church. There are people on that committee who over the years have expressed some interest in this matter, which is the most one has ever gotten from the United States Senate. And the consciousness which has resulted in the American people as a result of Watergate has reflected itself in a new Congress. And that is not a Congress which is courageously going to rush in and say, okay, let's do whatever we have to do to change this country. Of course, it is nothing like that. But it is a Congress which will be more responsive to us than any Congress in recent memory. The fact is that when we try to bring about change, we have to use the apparatus which is available and to try to bend it to our needs, the needs for which it was ostensibly established. I know if we get 10 million signatures, I know if there are millions of people in the streets, as they were. There are millions of people in the streets as there were in demands to end the war. Somewhere between paranoia and complacency, as I said, is where we have to be. That if we carry on the kind of operation for something which is very close to us, as the war was, of course there will be the changes. We can affect change. We can control our own destiny. And I think, therefore, that we cannot rely upon Congress at all, but we can rely upon ourselves to push them and move them. And after that is done, and after the educational level is raised, then we have the responsibility, especially those who have a vast amount of information, and there are any number of them here this evening and have been here over the weekend, to function as a committee of liaison with the relevant bodies of the Congress, to see to it that the information is presented, that the appropriate questions are asked of the appropriate people, and the appropriate people are called. And that, I think, has to be our response. And that, I think, must be our commitment. Those 11 years have passed now. They've brought us to the point where I think it is possible to now begin to take that second step. But I think it is the height of irresponsibility to think that we have arrived at the second step, that we don't need that hard work, the struggle that is ahead of us, that we don't need that we have the answers already. Because I believe it is clear that we do not have the answers. And I know various people have various positions to present. And that's fine. I think we have to work out a position which, like a convoy moving through troubled waters, moves at the speed of the slowest ship. And I think the slowest ship here, representing a good portion of the thought of people who have thoughtfully worked in this area for some years, is that we have to try to force the apparatus of government to function. Failing that, should that fail, then there are other suggestions that people have made. A tribunal in which we make our own charges and present our own evidence and do that as openly and publicly as we can. And there are probably other imaginative ideas that we can consider. We should perhaps even consider them now to let the power structure in this country know that they are not our last stop, that there are other efforts which we can make, and let them be aware of that as we are seeking to move them. But I think that must be our commitment, and that must be our responsibility. It's a lot harder to do it that way than it is to reel off the names without the evidence to support the names which we present. It's a lot harder to do it that way. I believe it is the only responsible way to do it. I believe it is the only way that we can do it, which will bring about the kind of change that all of us want. There are many people here with many different views, and tomorrow will not be as exciting. It's not geared as we're going to tell you who actually did it evening. It starts at noon tomorrow. Is it here? This room? Here? No. You see, we have different views even on that question as to where the meeting will be, but it'll be at the Union tomorrow. Okay. It'd be really important. It's going to be more important to be there tomorrow than it is to be here tonight. More important to be there tomorrow than to watch the Zapruder film over and over and over. It really is. It's more important because tomorrow we begin the hard work. Until today, the discussions were educational. People were curious, learned things that they didn't know before, participated in discussions, and learned things in various areas in terms of what has happened in the last decade in this country. But tomorrow is the important day, because tomorrow is the day when we begin to work out the way that we can finally get the information. And someone said in an earlier panel today, what difference does it make anyway? It happened 11 years ago, said in essence, something of that effect. A lot has happened during those 11 years, and those who don't understand their history are condemned to relive it. And a number of people said that a decade ago. We have to find out how it happened precisely, what agencies were involved, if in fact they were agencies, what role they played, and how aware of the factual information those people were who told us what was not true was true. That's crucial for us. It's really crucial for us. And that can only be done at this point. We've reached that first plateau. Nobody believes the damn Warren Commission report anymore. And that was a document which stood between the American people. It was the obstacle, the first obstacle, which stood between the American people and the truth about the death of the president and the truth about the cover-up. That has now been removed. It's been removed clearly in the minds of most people. We're now at that second stage, which has come so many years later, a stage in which the consciousness of the people of this country has been raised. It has been raised almost too far. What was unthinkable 10 years ago is thinkable now. In fact, there is nothing that is unthinkable any longer. Nothing. People are willing to believe almost anything at this point. And that places a great responsibility upon us, not to say just anything, because it will be believed and accepted. Because before we reach that point of cynicism, there has to be the point of absolute commitment to reality and evidence and hard work. And that's where we are at the present time. And tomorrow will be the opportunity for those of you and us who are seriously committed to learning the facts, to bringing about a change in this country, seeing to it that we can control our own destiny, that we don't have to elect someone after a lot of work, if we think that's the way to do it, just to see his brains blown out in Dallas on a sunny day with everybody watching, and know what that means to every subsequent president who is terrified to act out against the interests of those who carry the guns, because they knew and they know much more than we have known all of these years. And if we want to live in a kind of country where we can control our lives, then we have a commitment, which I think we have to undertake starting tomorrow. I ask you to be there at noon, to give a lot of thought to this and a lot of discussion to this between now and then, and be prepared tomorrow, come forward with some constructive ideas, and above all, a commitment to the kind of work that's going to have to be done all across this country so that 1975 can be the year, finally, when we find out who killed John Kennedy and why he was killed and why the government of the United States for 11 years has lied to us about that central question.
That was Mark Lane. I don't know if they intend to take questions from the audience at this time. I guess we'll just have to wait and see.
It's getting late. We don't want to exhaust you or ourselves. Why don't we just take about 15 or 20 minutes worth of questions? I'll try to make a brief summary, and then we'll call it till tomorrow.
Okay. People here are seeking a new political movement. They're calling on us, those of us with doubts who want to get out the truth. They're calling on us to write our congressman and to support people like Congressman Henry Gonzalez of Texas seeking to reopen examination of the John Kennedy assassination. They're further calling on the people of Massachusetts to write to the surviving Kennedy brother for him to do something. Maybe we ought to hear this question. The question has to do with the Kennedy family.
It's an interesting question, not central, I think. The assassination of John Kennedy was not a family affair, and the forensic evidence, I think, indicates what happened, whether the family was willing to accept it or not. But I'll tell you something which might shed some light upon what some members of the family thought. A man who went to school with Robert Kennedy went to a different school with Jim Garrison and became the contact between the two of them. He visited Jim Garrison in New Orleans while the preparation on the Clayshaw case was going forward, and he said to him, Bobby wants you to know that he completely supports the work that you are doing. He cannot say anything about it publicly now because he said there are guns between him and the White House. But when he is elected president, if he is, then he will break that matter wide open. And Garrison's answer to this gentleman was, I think his life is very much in danger as long as he is the repository of any exclusive information. And because of the powerful person he could be on this question if he spoke, his life is in danger. And I think that he's making a terrible mistake, said Garrison, in thinking that he's going to wait until that moment when he has the power because he's president. Because there's no sanctuary in the White House. He should know that his brother was killed not when he was running for office, but after he was elected. Why don't you take that back to him and ask him to speak out openly and publicly now? And I was in Garrison's office when the emissary returned after having seen Robert Kennedy. And Kennedy's response through this contact, this courier, was, he understands what you're saying, and he will speak out as soon as that last primary is over. He'll speak out and break the story then. But he does not want to do anything which will interfere with the primaries. He thinks he has them won now. You don't have to take my word for it, because on numerous occasions that question was asked after I was present and heard that conversation. And all I could say then is, well, feeling I couldn't betray that confidence, which wasn't even delivered to me, I was just a bystander listening, all I could say is it's not a family affair, let's look at the forensic evidence. Then one night I was doing a television program in Washington, D.C. It was a two-way TV show, and the live studio audience was Jack Anderson, as a matter of fact. And people were calling up, and that question was asked, except it was specifically, what's Robert Kennedy's position on the assassination of John Kennedy? And I started to say, well, I'm not sure it's irrelevant. I said, 1 second. This is the primary night out there. And it's 10 o'clock here in Washington, D.C., 7 o'clock out there. The polls have closed or about to close. Nothing I say in this local program is going to reach there in any event. I'll tell you. And I told that whole story. I said, so we can just look forward to later this evening or early tomorrow morning, perhaps, if Bobby wins, or perhaps even if he loses and he's out of the race, but certainly if he wins, we can hear him maybe for the first time speak openly about his feelings on this question and how he is now dedicated to breaking the case wide open. Jack Anderson was there, in fact, and wrote a column about that because a few hours later, Robert Kennedy did not break the case wide open. He was shot, and soon after that he died. And Jack Anderson wrote a column about what he had observed, which he referred to in his column. His headline was Ominous Prediction, which he told the story of what I'd said on the program, but actually it was not, the ominous prediction was not mine. It was Robert Kennedy's, who had spoken about the guns that stood between him and the White House. That's, as far as Teddy Kennedy is concerned, I don't know. I know that for a long time Bobby would not talk about the case. I was one of John Kennedy's two campaign managers for New York City when he ran in 1960. And worked close. Bobby came in, there were always problems because there was a reform movement with Eleanor Roosevelt and Herbert Lehman, Tom Finletter, and the regular organization led by Carmine DeSapio. And there were always trouble between the two factions during the campaign, and Bobby was always flying in to give direction, so to speak, in a relatively ruthless fashion, but in any event, he came in regularly. And so we had this working relationship of sorts. And after the assassination, I called him some weeks later and said, I want to talk with you. He said, all right. We set a date. This was Tuesday. We set a date for lunch on Thursday. And he said, you don't want to talk about that matter, do you? I said, you never even referred to it. I said, you mean the assassination of your brother? Yes. I said, that's what I want to talk about. He said, I will not talk about that. I will not think about that. I will not talk about that. He said, is there anything else you want to talk with me about at lunch? I said, no, just that. He said, well, there's no sense having lunch then. And I said, I think that you have a great responsibility. He said, I don't want to hear about my responsibility, about that, and I will not talk about that. I called him 2 or 3 more times. The conversation was almost identical. And he would never talk about the assassination of his brother until he was ready that last moment, and then it was too late. How about Jackie? I never talked to Jackie. Jackie testified before the Warren Commission. We know that when they ask about what kind of a dress she was wearing and various other things, that the evidence, the testimony is printed in full. When she was asked about the only relevant thing she was asked, the wounds that she observed on her husband, who, as you've seen the film, who was in her arms, it said, bracket, all reference to wounds deleted, close bracket. So we don't know what she told the commission. I don't know of any investigator who she did talk to.
Can you produce that man that you said was the intermediary?
It's not necessary, you see, because, as I say, it was on a television program, the entire discussion, prior to the time that Bobby was shot.
The intermediary that you mentioned this man and you named him.
Yeah, I know his name, of course, because I was there in the room. It's a confidence which runs between him and Jim Garrison, and I think that Garrison might be willing to release the name, but that's entirely up to him.
It's all cool. It's all cool. Let's keep on the subject. Yeah. All right. Is there somebody? Yeah. Well, some people are raising questions about who's doing the taping.
Of the audience at this event.
Is our AIB people somebody who's?
No, he's asking about filming.
Which film?
Filming, not taping.
We're making a yearbook of the audience.
Who's
He's talking about filming.
who's filming?
What we talk about is who is taking the film and why are so many films being taken of the audience? And I think that's a goddamn legitimate question.
Who's taking?
asked us down here to videotape, to make a videotape about the whole conference. Who is us? Us, okay. Most of us are from Channel 3 in Somerville, a public access cable television station.
Thank you.
Okay?
And you have a limited number of people to take pictures of, it gets pretty boring after a while. I mean, that's just the way. Wait a second. Wait, I don't mean it to be light. I don't want to make light of it. But I mean, a person with a camera in their hands has a tendency to look for interesting shots. Okay? If there's anybody who wants to sit through the tape and wants their face off, we'll edit it out. That won't be a problem. And most of it, and most of the shots we do have is of the speakers and very little of the audience. See, what happens is we have 3 cameras going. Only one at a time is going into the one that's being taped, okay? Well, let me finish. The question was asked. I want to finish, okay? So only one camera's on at a time. 2 might be facing the audience, but the one that's being on the tape is only the one that's on the speaker. That's most of the time. The stuff that went on was of the speaker. Anybody is welcome to watch it. Any more questions?
You know, I think it goes deeper than that, from the standpoint that we know damn good and well how police and CIA can steal all them goddamn film from y'all tonight. And I think that when people come into another meeting like this, they should be asked if it's anyone in that audience. Now, we do that in nightclubs because somebody might come in with somebody else's goddamn wife with no intentions of being filmed on film. And there's no need to have somebody that didn't come in here to be public without their consent. And I think, you know.
All right, could we move this thing on a little bit? Yeah.
Question to Mae Brussell about the Eustasi, which she talks about on her radio programs.
The question is about the Eustasi. How many of you know what the Eustasi is? Eustasi is an organization formed in Yugoslavia. Members of the Eustasi killed the King of Yugoslavia in 1934, King Peter. They escaped. 2 members of the Eustasi escaped to Italy, and Mussolini armed them to take over when Hitler went into Yugoslavia, and they formed the most devilish concentration camps and horrors, And they specialize in domestic turmoil, in violence, in counterintelligence. And Hitler asked them to cool off because their experiments, their heads in the streets, the bodies dissected publicly were so grotesque that Hitler asked them to cool off with their experimentations, and they killed 50, 60, 70, 80,000 people in Yugoslavia. And when World War II was over, their headquarters were set up in Australia, in California, in Spain, and they're very important now because they are causing national violence around the world, airport hijackings, the bombing at the Pan Am in Los Angeles, I believe. Miriam Kerbekovic is of Ustasi. A Yugoslavian was put in allegedly by E. Howard Hunt to kill Sirhan Sirhan. There's a contract out there for $25,000 to kill him. The Ustasi are being used as they were in World War II, again in the Nazification of America, to spread terror so that our police state will have a need for a police state. The Ustasi, the war criminals, one of the heads of them, Arturkovich, is living in Huntington Beach, California. There have been deportations for him because of the thousands of people he killed. These were quietly hushed up. He had his third hearing in the last 20 years, and it was turned down that he wouldn't be deported because no country wants him. They won't send him to Yugoslavia because he's a war criminal. Switzerland doesn't want him, so California inherits him. The Ustasi, from headquarters down in Australia, is causing violence at our airports, on our streets, and problems in Europe and around the world as an excuse for more police. Ustasi were active World War II, and they're active now because the war is in our country, and they're continuing here. Don can tell you some more about it, because he and I are working on it.
Except to remember that it's not a Croatian problem. These are exiles run by the CIA in the same way that Cubans are run, in the same way that white Russians in the Dallas area were run, in the same way that Latinos in New Orleans were run. But again, you've got to always see that as a second team and not get caught up in the ethnicity, except that the particularly savage kamikaze ethos of this group is beyond almost anything, and they're far less publicized than the Cubans and so on, who have now about outlived their usefulness.
Yeah, these are proven war criminals by the hundreds of thousands, and sadism and kamikaze, and this is why that Miriam Kerbekovic in Los Angeles, who had 2 master's degrees in science, who worked at a lab, who had chemical warfare, who could spread biological or chemical warfare over Los Angeles, channeled not by Mr. Colby, but 8 money washings to terrorize all of Los Angeles, blow up airports, Greyhound buses, tie up transportation. They're flexing their muscles. This Kerbekovic doesn't have to stand trial. They say he's too sick. He's not a deaf mute. He's playing dumb. He made $1,000 a week. He was in a very heavy lab that should be investigated. If you want to stop political violence in the United States right now, pressure your congressman to find out who Miriam Kerbekovic is. He came from Yugoslavia to Germany to Canada to Los Angeles to the lab. He's financed, he has a double, he has passports, he's not a mute. And if you want to be safe at an airport or on a street or a shopping center, there's 100,000 ready like him if you don't stop and find out who Miriam Kerbekovic is. Miriam Kerbekovic, he was just apprehended. He blew up the Pan Am, or allegedly, I don't know for sure because the way our agencies work, he says that he was framed by the same people that own the Los Angeles Police Department. And that man knows, because I know the Central Intelligence Agency owns it. And he's the man who, handcuffed, was supposed to have knocked a hole through the floor of the courthouse last week, was dangling from one floor to the other after killing 3 people with tight security to give the cover that he's insane so he doesn't have to stand trial and spill the beans. They had him dangling between the Los Angeles courthouse, the 2nd and 3rd floor, with a protest sign that Nixon runs insane asylums. I haven't seen any criminal in the California prison system with leg and handcuffs who's protesting with signs dangling between the 2nd and 3rd floor. So you better check out Kerbevoic, Murim is his name. And if you don't want to be blown up walking down the street, just check that one case out and you'll stop domestic violence for the next 5 years if you pin who brought him into this country. It's just that simple, that particular case.
I want to add something to that.
We'll let him add, and that'll be it.
Let me just add something. It's up to the audience whether they want to stay. I just want to add something which is quite amazing. I wasn't aware that Mae was working on it, but our group in Chicago has uncovered a very hot situation which happens to be related to that, which I wasn't aware of until tonight. If any of you saw the film or the book, The Odessa File, I'm here to tell you publicly, at the first public meeting that I've mentioned this, that we have a substantial portion of the American Odessa File which is related to what she is talking about. Nazis that have gotten into high position in this government, including a high position in the LA police, in the space program, and in the court system. And they were brought in here with fake Irish passports through the help of a certain church. They've been brought in from 1944 on, and Ehrlichman and others in the White House cover this up.
That's fascinating. One of the
We're going to name names.
Is high in the space program. I think you're on exactly the same case.
It's the American Odessa File, and we have 123 of the names. They're going to be named.
We'll have to hope that they repeat that question. We can't seem to pick it up on our microphones. Can't even pick it up on my ears.
Well, what's happening? I learned that Dan Rather made those statements during the 4 days after the assassination.
Let the people ask their question.
When I was lecturing in Santa Monica, a young friend named Ivan Dreyer had the 4 days on tape. I gave him a Zapruder film, and we tied Dan Rather's voice to the action of the film. I realize that Rather is rather unhappy about it now. I chased him for 3 years trying to make him look at the film. On the 10th anniversary, Associated Press wanted to do a story on me. My only requirement was, if you'll look at some film I've got, you can write any damn thing you want to about me. State editor for AP in Texas looked at the film in my home. He asked to see it again. I showed it to him again. He said, "You know, Rather ought to be asked about that." Oh, I said, "I think so too." And then the AP editor called Rather, couldn't get him that day, but he called the next day and got him, and he called and told me, said, "Rather says he made an honest error. Why in the hell didn't he leave the adjective off? Let us decide." Besides that, it had been 10 years, and he'd had hundreds of hours of national television time to tell the American people, "I made a hell of an error on November the 24th, 1963. Instead of that, he has to wait until I push him to the wall. This film was shown at the Democratic Convention, and newsmen there asked Rather about it, and he said no comment. But when he couldn't run from AP, he says he made an honest error. More important than that, recently he was on a talk show in Dallas, and a very knowledgeable caller called in and asked where Rather was. He said, "I was just beyond the overpass, waiting for a film drop." Why beyond the overpass? The motorcade was going to speed up at the overpass. So he's going to be trying to catch this film going about 50 or 60 miles an hour. In addition to that, he didn't say who was going to give him that film drop. He didn't say what the film showed, if anything. He didn't say where that film was ever shown. Dan Rather has a lot of questions to answer. I know he's unhappy with me, and I'm delighted that he is.
Mark,
everything about except whether or not Rather showed up at the cocktail party. He did not show up at the cocktail party. However, he and I are speaking on the same platform at the University of California, Los Angeles on February 20th. And if he shows up there will have an opportunity to see the film with his voice on it. It's the Zapruder film with Rather's voice. Explain it.
They're starting.
Who wants to respond? The question is, why hasn't the Zapruder film been shown on TV?
We almost ran out of them, but I kept a few.
Yeah.
We had some on the table back there.
The extended Zapruder.
There?
I would like to say this. I agree that there's one other thing I forgot a while ago. There's another thing you could do, and that is to demand of Congress that they use the same justice on Life magazine that they used on Marina Oswald. Congress passed a law and took the gun away from Marina. Doesn't make a damn, it wasn't used anyway. But Congress now should pass the law and take this film away from Life magazine and show it repeatedly on nationwide television.
The question is about the assassination of Malcolm X in New York City.
The question is, I'd like to hear some conversation about the assassination of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. From what I've been able to find out about the Malcolm X assassination, there were cracks in the walls where actually all of the shooting took place from, and the people in the audience that was found to be guilty of it was really just a decoy. I'm not saying they didn't hit him, but what had happened is Malcolm X was planning on going to the UN to take the issue of racism and put it before the world body. I think Ralph Sherman gave me more research on that than anyone else, and that was a meeting that took place in London, England, with a guy that's referred to as a black guy, although he was Indian, named DePinto, who was the editor of Pan-African magazine, and it was he the one that suggested to Malcolm that would be a good idea, and both of them was planning on going to the UN. The Sunday that Malcolm was gunned down in New York, DePinto was gunned down in Nairobi along that same time. And so it's very evidence that, the CIA or government agents was involved with that. Now, I have my own theory about what happened with Martin Luther King. And that theory goes back to the day that the Pueblo was captured in North Korea. If you would go back and review the news, you will see that Lyndon Johnson got on television and very excited signed an executive order which federalized 100 and some odd thousand National Guardmen and 25,000 Air National Guard because he claimed that we might have to get involved in Korea. I personally believe Martin Luther King was killed because they thought black folks was going to, burn 50 or 60 cities, and at that point they could bring in martial law. Because, see, I thoroughly believe they want to create a situation now that they can suspend the Constitution, dissolve the Senate and Congress, and bring in martial law to further notice. I think once Gerald Ford steps down and Rockefeller become president, I think you're going to see violence escalated to a certain extent that the American people will say, bring it on. If you look at what the CIA is into now, I don't think it's an accident that we're getting all these bombings. I just happen to be a person that just don't believe you can bomb the State Department. Like the State Department ended up getting bombed the other day unless and you someone connected with it. But if these buildings get blowed up time and time again, and if a school get blowed up and is blamed on black militants, or a black school gets blowed up and is blamed on right-wing radicals, and if enough buildings is blowed up, and the Puerto Ricans, they say, blowed up that restaurant in New York City, if you blow up enough good restaurants where enough rich folks go, see, poor folks get very upset when rich folks get killed. And it was more poor folks concerned about Patty Hearst than rich folks would have been concerned about some poor black sharecropper's daughter. And so, knowing the way, the basic American people think in this country. And now, if you go back to the evening Martin Luther King was shot, the first news that came over the radio, before they could even say he was dead or knew anything about it, they kept saying a white person did it. And that's not the normal trend in America. You know, they go out of their way to hide that. And that evening, LBJ sent the exact amount of National Guardmen across this country, of military. They weren't National Guard now, they're soldiers. Sent the exact amount of soldiers across this country to deal with riot duty that he just happened to federalize during the Pueblo. Now, that's just my personal thoughts of why Martin Luther King was killed. I mean, there was no other reason. Martin Luther King wasn't into nothing. He didn't have nothing going as far as conspiracy. About a year before that, he called me in the hotel room and asked me would I do him a favor. And I said, what is it, Martin? He said, would you explain to me what the mafia is? And I did, you know. And I think the only reason that he was killed was for that reason. And I think right now, the one thing we got to watch for, and I think this is what the whole thing is on food, that they'll create the type of violence across this country where they can suspend that Constitution. And I think this is what it's all about.
Fellas now going up to stage to take the mic. He spoke at one of the earliest sessions, and I got the feeling that, his question said something about how Watergate was designed to do in Richard Nixon. We'll hear what his question is.
I hope I'm not crazy doing this, but here goes. I've been into this thing for 11 years. I've corresponded with Mr. Jones, Ms. Brussell, and a couple of other people that aren't here, Mr. Sprague and so forth. And I know some of these fellows in the AIB pretty well, at least Mr. Katz. I wrote to my congressman, and these people say, write to your congressman. I said, okay, I'll write to mine. I wrote to my congressman. I got a letter back. It said, what I wrote was simply, I have been in correspondence with this Mr. Gonzalez for 6 months, and I've sent him everything that I've ever heard and got, and he was very thankful for it, and I wish him all the luck in the world. Now, I decided to write to my congressman about letting him know about Henry Gonzalez's intention of reinvestigating the whole thing. Well, I got a letter back from my congressman saying, you should be pleased to know that I have made your comments known to the Justice Department. The Justice Department is not Henry Gonzalez. I wrote to the Irvin Committee when they were in session, and I wrote to them about allegations made by a number of people up here about links between the assassination of John Kennedy and the Watergate case. I got a form letter back, and I got my income tax audited 2 weeks later. You're not playing around with something small. I hear emotional speeches up here. I'm a nobody. You can see I'm nervous. You've heard emotional speeches up here about getting you people together and doing something about it. You're not going to. I heard a woman up here asked a ridiculous question, why the Zapruder film has never been on TV. Don't you realize Mr. Skolnick is trying to scare you? He's right. There are people being murdered. There are tremendous things going on. You have the control of the media, politics. Mr. Scott is telling you he can verify these things about business, big business, oil men, and so forth. You're not dealing with something small. Everyone in this room, if you haven't read it, you should read 1984. Mr. Orwell had a crystal ball, and it's frightening. 85% of the people he called proles, they sat on their rear ends, and as someone mentioned, Mr. Gregory, they watched the Super Bowl. You're not going to be able to come here tomorrow and just organize yourselves on some kind of little level. You're going to need, there's 200 million people. You're going to have to get millions of them to listen to you. Frankly, I don't think you can do it. I'm pessimistic about it, and some of the people I've talked to feel the same way. I don't think you can do it. I hope to God you can, because I don't want to have to leave this country. But you're going to need millions of them. Keep that in mind. I've heard people applauding and going, that was a very good speech. Those were nice words. 200 million people. You're going to have to get millions of them. Thank you.
That is the best reason of all for taking a videotape of something like this and trying to get it spread around. There is legitimate reason for people's media.
The problem alluded to by the gentleman who just spoke is one of the central problems that everyone faces right now. It was shown in studies on word-of-mouth transmission of information, studies done during World War II at MIT, that rumor travels fastest when there is no news from official sources. Some of you may have noticed that the last 5 weeks have been a gradually increasing news blackout by a new technique where they jam the television channels with irrelevant local news, axe murders, and all sorts of garbage to prevent the transmission of relevant information from Southeast Asia, Europe, etc., etc., etc. This is obviously being orchestrated because I've been to several towns and I've noticed that it's the same. In New York, we don't get any Boston news. In Boston, you don't know what's going on in Chicago. The country is being fragmented information-wise. Therefore, word-of-mouth information becomes tremendously important. I'd like to point out something to you, that if two persons tell two persons tell two persons some bit of information, by the time you've moved 10 persons out in the circle, over 1,000 people know what you know. It's too, well, the other thing that they turned up in the MIT studies was this, that a piece of information, if true, tended to reinforce its validity as it travels. If it's false, it tends to develop 15 different stories and sift into the sand. Now, this is tremendously important in times like this when they're trying to put a bag over our heads by filling the channels with a lot of garbage that's designed to jack the anxiety level and to prevent you from thinking straight. So that word-of-mouth transmission becomes tremendously important right now. And I suggest that everybody here, I make this formal suggestion that everybody here tonight make a point of telling at least 2 persons tomorrow who have not been here the gist of what's transpired, particularly what the Zapruder film looks like. And ask each one of those 2 persons to pass it on to 2 more people and see what the net result of that is.
Hold it.
Mr. Skolnick mentioned the fact that he was the head of, or PRA head of Congress. I'd like to know if he's done any research into the death of his daughter. The fact that at the time that he was running for re-election, there was a possibility that he might be a potential presidential candidate. Would this be viewed as another attempt to limit the choice of candidates that we as voters have by creating
I think now you're asking who found and murdered Percy's daughter in
64, I believe it was, 66. I think knowledgeable people recognize that it was Percy's wife that did that. She had an emotional problem, which I don't want to go into long details about. It was an inside job. His daughter was palling around with somebody that was undesirable in some way. And that's a simple answer to a very complicated matter. But the issue that I brought up was that the 3 major owners of United Airlines, Nelson and David Rockefeller and Senator Percy, and that is probably more relevant to our discussion than what happened to Percy's daughter, which I believe happens to be a matter personal to Percy. I believe he offered a reward there for no reason. I think he already knew who killed his daughter.
Sherman Skolnick, and at that point we conclude the Saturday night general session of a conference on the politics of assassinations and conspiracy. The topic tonight was Who Done It? This program was recorded on February 1st, 1975 by Pacifica radio affiliate WBUR in Boston. The conference was sponsored by the Assassination Information Bureau, and for more information you could write to the AIB at 63 Inman Street, Cambridge, Massachusetts, 02139. This is Vic Wheatman speaking.
This is Our Hidden History